Story 1.
I planted a loud surprise in my cheating wife's purse and activated it during her affair. Undoubtedly, my hobby bench was the thing I'd missed the most. It served as my sanctuary, a place for soul healing. There was nothing wrong with my soul, it's just an interesting way to convey a degree of unhappiness. Somewhere along the line, things fell apart, and there's no specific time I can pinpoint, because it happened gradually. I'm quite handy around the house, capable of fixing almost anything. I dislike calling a repairman for a simple task and paying him almost a whole day's wages for a few hours of subpar work. Anyway, what I can't fix is my marriage. To explain, it's like a fine piece of china. You can glue a broken plate back together, but it's never like the original. Once a marriage is broken, it can be repaired, but never restored to its original condition. I didn't want a patched-up broken plate. After 18 years of marriage, my wife Tracy decided to explore relationships with other men, at least one that I know of. By the time I found out, it was too late to prevent the breakage. Slow at recognizing relationship issues, I assumed everything was fine. We married right after high school, had a daughter named Carly immediately, and complications meant we couldn't have more, but we were content. My job as an auto body man paid well, but there was no real future to it. I could open my own shop, but I never desired business ownership. Things were fine as long as the money was adequate. Tracy spent the evenings taking night classes at the local community college, a bit more ambitious than I, actually a lot more ambitious. When Carly started school, Tracy began working, improving our family life with the extra money. With 2 incomes, we scraped up enough to buy a small house in a nice neighborhood. There was never a desire for a bigger or better place. For years, Tracy didn't waste money on frivolous things. She dressed and groomed well while watching expenses. My wardrobe expenses were usually limited to jeans and flannel shirts. She cleaned up well, but I always looked a bit unkempt with my bushy eyebrows and long hair in a ponytail. Not a wannabe hippie or biker, I just liked my hair that way. No one teased May had enough body build to intimidate them if necessary. The downside to my grooming habits was Tracy's occasional embarrassment when we went out. She never said anything, but I always felt it. As Carly grew, Tracy spent more time at work, becoming an expert in insurance claims. She enjoyed her work, bringing home more money than me, without comment. By Carly's high school years, Tracy evolved into a sophisticated businesswoman, spending more on clothing as her status grew. Frequent trips to the beauty salon and nights at the gym transformed her into an attractive woman, while I remained a grungy, hairy embarrassment. The next step in our marriage's progression was inevitable. Over the years, my relationship with Carly grew stronger. I spent more time with her than her mother, and we developed a bond. Tracy was either at work or working at home. Family time decreased as fast as Tracy's career increased. Our personal time also dwindled. She was always too tired, and I sensed I was no longer the man she once dreamed of spending her life with. I grew up in a public housing project. My mother, a single parent, raised my brother Robert and me by working as a waitress. It was tough for her, and we didn't make it any easier, constantly in trouble, as that was the nature of life in the projects. Many of my character traits carried into my marriage. I was rash and quick-tempered, which landed me in juvenile hall a few too many times. Tracy was aware of the problem, but since we were married, I had kept it under control and actually became a little placid. As Tracy and I drifted apart, I sought solace in my basement hobby shop, a dank little hole. Distressed about my failing marriage, I didn't know what to do. Despite trying the usual things like flowers and gifts, weekly expensive dinners, and good wine, nothing worked. In despair, I retreated into my little haven at every opportunity. Carly remained the bright spot in my life, but I felt I was letting her down. I viewed myself as a defective father and husband. Were these feelings self-induced, or did Tracy impose them on me? She loved me. She would never do that. To divert my mind from my shortcomings, I spent hours creating electronic gadgets, simple gadgets available anywhere. My first project, a fake video surveillance camera, was fun to make, although it served no real purpose. As I gained experience, my projects became more elaborate, yet I never advanced beyond being a mere tinkerer. During weekends, Carly and I frequented yard sales and flea markets. She acquired retro clothes while I collected old electronic and remote control toys. Tracy stayed at home. 2 months ago, I sensed Tracy was cheating. It didn't take me long to verify it. She was visiting Todd Wick, a coworker, at his apartment every Tuesday and Thursday for 2-hour lunches. Tracy hadn't made much effort to conceal the relationship. I didn't know if she felt complacent or just didn't give a damn. The plate was broke and irreparable. At this point, I decided that something had to be done. I spent the whole day preparing for my departure. Carly was starting college in 3 weeks, and everything was paid up for the first 2 semesters. Although I'd miss her, I felt it was time to cut the apron strings. I took half of the savings account, unconcerned about other financial matters. I just needed enough to get away and start over. Filing for divorce appeared overly intricate and futile in my view. Instead, I had my attorney create a power of attorney for Tracy to sell the house. Papers were also prepared to sue Todd Wickham and Continental Memorial Insurance, although my expectations were low due to their shared workplace. Despite this, the lawyer was willing to attempt anything for a potential percentage. I instructed him to proceed. The majority of the evening was spent working on my modified alarm keychain, which was no longer just a keychain but now boasted a surprisingly loud alarm for its size. To achieve this, I upgraded the battery to 9 volts for increased volume and duration. I configured it for remote activation and ensured it couldn't be turned off. The device, encased in a 3-inch PVC plastic with 20 drilled holes, had a small antenna wire protruding. After completion, I affixed 2 PVC caps on each end and painted it flat black with barbecue paint, though the reason for the paint choice was unclear. If everything went as planned, the only way to stop it would be to drop it into water. Attempts to make it watertight muted the sound, so I left it as is. Tracy had been in bed for a while, making it easy for me to slip the gadget into her purse lining through a small hole in one of the side pockets. I estimated it would take at least 5 minutes for someone to locate and extract it from the bottom of the purse, which was sufficient for my purpose of provoking irritation before my departure. After carefully checking my work, I spent the next few hours loading desired items into my truck, picking up my body shop tools, and doing a final check. That afternoon, clothing retrieval could wait until morning. With everything ready after Tracy left for work, I spent the night on the sofa. My wife, dressed for work, inquired about my morning plans. I explained that I got tied up with a project the previous night and was catching a few hours of sleep. She asked if I would eat anything, and I replied that I would just have coffee and an English muffin. Before leaving, she reminded me to rinse my dishes. As she pulled out of the driveway, I couldn't help but notice how good she looked. Was I going to miss her? At least for a while. I grabbed some trash bags and headed for the bedroom, intending to collect the clothing I needed or wanted. Suddenly, my daughter Carly confronted me, questioning my actions. I responded, asking why she wasn't at school, and she revealed that she already met all her curriculum requirements. She insisted that I answer her question. I placed the bags on the floor and looked at Carly, offering her coffee. As we walked into the kitchen, she managed a small laugh and asked if I had figured out that Mom was cheating on me. I acted cool and asked, "Figured what out?" Carly revealed that she found out about 2 months ago and expressed frustration that I hadn't done anything sooner. I explained that I only recently discovered the situation and was planning to leave. Carly pressed me for details and asked if I had talked to Mom. I admitted that I hadn't and questioned if she had. Carly explained that she confronted Mom about 2 months ago, but Mom provided no satisfactory explanation. It seemed like Mom wanted to get caught. We sat quietly for a few moments, contemplating the situation. I revealed that I didn't know where I would be going, while Carly shared her plans for college. I assured her that I had taken care of everything I could ahead of time. Carly asked about my boat and belongings. I mentioned my friend Felix from the project, and how he would help me with a few things, including taking care of my boat. As I put the cups in the sink, I realized I never made that English muffin. Carly asked about the boat again, and when she realized I was giving it to Felix, she smiled. In that moment, I couldn't help but feel a deep appreciation for my daughter. 20 minutes later, I was hooking the boat up to the truck. When I got the boat, I was hoping that it was something the family could enjoy together. Unfortunately, it was not Tracy's cup of tea. She hated the boat and the water. Carly and I went by ourselves a few times, but it wasn't the same. After that, the boat just sat by the garage. I would not miss it. I had a few firearms and a deer rifle that my dad gave me before he moved to Florida. Felix would get more use out of them than I would, even though he didn't hunt. I piled all of my snap-on and power tools into the back of the boat. Mr. Handyman had retired. Felix was barely awake when I got to his place. He had 2 mixed-breed girls living with him, but it became quickly evident that they were not morning people. Felix got us a couple of early morning beers and the girls went back to bed. When I was 15, Felix and I broke into a golf course maintenance shed. The sprinkler system for all 18 holes was old and had been done in copper. The maintenance shed had been full of copper fittings necessary to maintain the system. I decided that a lot of money could be made by reselling the copper, and Felix was more than eager to join with me. Needless to say, we got caught, or at least I did. Felix got away. The cops knew that there were 2 of us, but I always insisted that it was only me. I got 2 years probation for being dumb, but made a lifelong friend because I kept my mouth shut. Felix was as white as I was, but he insisted on talking as if he were from the ghetto instead of the projects. There was not much difference, but Felix had to get by in a different environment than I did. He adapted to his world, and I couldn't fault him for that. Felix questioned me about dragging the boat around and asked if we were going fishing. I explained that it was a present for my best buddy, and he jokingly claimed to be my only friend. I then told Felix that I was leaving town for a while and needed him to take care of my belongings. I slid the boat and trailer title across the kitchen table, and Felix laughed, thinking I was joking. However, I assured him it was a trade. I needed him to do something for me in return. Felix, eager to help, asked if I wanted someone passed away, but I clarified that I just wanted the person to spend some time in the emergency room or recovery ward. I emphasized not to kill him, only to hurt him. Felix's smile grew, and I explained that I wanted this to happen every 6 weeks for 6 months, or until the person left town. Curious about the reason, Felix asked if the person took Tracy from me. He immediately regretted his words, apologized, and fetched 2 more beers from the fridge. I handed Felix a 3x5 card with the name, address, and license number of Todd Wickham, and asked him to wait a couple of weeks before taking any action. He looked at the card and nodded toward the door. The power tools and weapons were gravy that he had not expected. He took them inside the house while I unhooked the boat. We talked for a few more minutes and then parted ways. I could trust Felix. A year ago, I would have said that there were 2 people I trusted. Now, there was just Felix. It was Tuesday. Tracy and Todd walked out of the company building and got into his Lexus at 11, right on the dot. Since I knew where they were going, I had no trouble following them to Todd's apartment. There was nothing lovey-dovey going on. They were just acting like a married couple. I gave them 15 minutes to get settled in and then hit the button on the remote control. Nothing occurred. The darn thing didn't function. What the heck did I do wrong? I exited the truck and approached the apartment building, pressing the button once more. Still no response. While contemplating my next move, I opted to deflate Todd's tires in desperation. He might as well be productive. I only targeted the 2 tires on the side, away from the building. In a last-ditch effort, I walked right up to the side of the building and tried again. It finally worked. I was outside of the apartment building, and the noise was loud and clear. The sound inside had to be extremely loud. It blared for about a second, paused for 2 seconds, and then repeated. Everyone in the apartment complex was now being entertained by my little gadget. I grinned as I walked back to the truck. Halfway down the block, I could still hear the beeping. Things were progressing better than anticipated. My lawyer was having the lawsuit papers delivered to Todd and the company at 2. I would be gone by then. Carly was waiting for me when I got home. She handed me a card with her college address and her cell phone number, which I already had. She had a few extra things for me to take that I had missed, and even packed me a lunch so that I wouldn't have to stop until I got out of the state. She actually explained that when she gave it to me. We both had a good laugh and a hug. I left the power of attorney and my wedding ring on the kitchen table. Carly stated that she would be more than happy to explain things to her mother. My body tools were in the back of the truck under the bed cover. My personal stuff was jammed behind the seat in the cab. As I pulled away from the house for the last time, my cell phone rang. It was Tracy. I turned the phone off. It would have been interesting to hear what she had to say, but I refused to give her the satisfaction. Interstate 81 South was the best escape route. I didn't stop until I hit Chattanooga. It was a sleazy motel, but there was a bar next door. Big mistake. I drank way too much, and then discovered that, while I was sleeping it off, one or more of the local boys borrowed all of my body shop tools. The back of the truck was picked clean, but they didn't touch anything in the cab. I don't know if that was because of integrity or maybe they just couldn't carry anymore. I showered, shaved, and put on fresh clothes. After a much-needed breakfast at the local Waffle House, I hit the road for Nashville. I was kicking myself for being so damn dumb and trying to figure out what to do next. Without tools, I wasn't even going to try and get a body shop job. I settled in at one of the Crystals in the area and started going through the help wanted ads. Most of the jobs were commission sales or minimum wage jobs. The ones that fell into normal categories I wasn't qualified for until I hit a small 3-line ad: wanted auto damage appraiser. Must have body shop experience. Conrad Insurance Company. I turned my cell phone on, called the listed number, and got a name, address, and an appointment in 1 hour. I deleted the 5 calls that came from Tracy, punched the address into the GPS, and headed right over. I always liked to be early. I had never gone on a job interview before and realized that I was not dressed for one. It was too late now. What they see is what they get. There were 3 other guys there when I arrived. They were all well-dressed and looking good. Each of them had a folder in his hand, which I assumed was a resume. Each one entered the manager's office, stayed 5 minutes, and left. They didn't look happy. I was feeling pretty good because I didn't think I could do worse than they did. The guy behind the desk was dressed well, but the clothes didn't fit the man. He was hard, with cracked skin and faded tats sticking out around different parts of his clothes. His hands were the things that I noticed most. They were calloused and gnarly, just like mine. This guy wasn't an executive. He was a metal beater wearing people clothes. He noticed me smiling and sort of smiled back. It didn't take him long to read over the interview form that I had filled out in the lobby. I believe I left half of the spaces empty. It wasn't a smart-ass move. I simply lacked the information to fill them. Hemingway, Daniel Hemingway, I clarified to him. No, I am not related to the famous author. He seemed relieved and expressed that he wouldn't want intellectuals hanging around the office. Grady Burgess, the man I was talking to, introduced himself and inquired about my presence. I made it clear that I wouldn't try to con him, having witnessed others being excused for attempting to give him any nonsense. I explained that I got drunk the night before in Chattanooga, and all my shop gear was stolen from my truck while I slept it off. I mentioned, it's hard to get a shop job without the necessary gear, so this seemed like a good alternative. Grady seemed to understand, but he sensed there might be more to the story. I admitted that my judgment was clouded due to finding out about my wife cheating on me after 18 years of marriage. Grady asked about my wife's current location, and I replied that she was in Pennsylvania. He called Marcy, a woman in her mid-40 seconds, to bring us 2 coffees. She set down 2 plain white ceramic cups without cream or sugar. Grady, with a loud voice, instructed her to cancel the rest of the appointments, indicating that they had found what they were looking for. Marcy gave Grady a scowl and then gave me a little wink. I was looking a little sheepish when I noticed that Grady was smiling at my embarrassment. We chatted for about 2 hours, and then he carefully explained to me what the job entailed, as well as the pay and benefits. The only downside to the whole deal was the image requirements. 80% of my job was going to involve contact with customers. Image was paramount. That meant a haircut and a complete change in grooming habits. I was expected to get a new wardrobe and a shoe shine kit. He emphasized that Marcy would personally help me with everything that needed to be done. I was expected to be in Atlanta by Monday morning for a full week of training. Conrad Insurance was an independent company, but worked as a subcontractor for several larger national auto insurers. Everything had to be done to specific standards. The company paid all the expenses related to the training, but the clothes and grooming were coming out of my pocket. Marcy seemed to enjoy the rest of the week, more than I did. I was a little project for her. I insisted on going to a barber shop rather than a hairdresser's, but she made all of the rest of the decisions. Not only did I get a haircut, but I also got my eyebrows and ears trimmed and my nose hairs pruned. Marcy informed the barber that I would be back every 10 days for the same treatment. My working clothes were pretty generic khaki pants and white shirts. She even found a jacket that went with the pants. I also got 2 pairs of black steel-toe dress shoes with a dozen pairs of black socks. She had found a small studio apartment for me and helped me get it set up. Friday morning, I got my Tennessee driver's license, and that afternoon, Marcy gave me the keys to my company car and a laptop computer. Before leaving me at the apartment that evening, she stood on her tiptoes and kissed me on the cheek. She expressed admiration, saying that if Grady wasn't so jealous, she'd have to jump my bones. While flattered, the thought of her suggestion made me shiver a little. It was time to give Carly a call. I spoke with Carly and shared that I'd been hired for a desk job doing appraisals out in the field. I explained it was the first place I applied to, and I seemed to be in the right place at the right time. Carly asked about home, and I mentioned that I was fine, but Mom was a wreck. Carly was surprised, expecting Mom to be happy to see me gone. I noted that it seemed like Mom had a plan, but I messed it up somehow. Carly shared that Mom spent the first day sitting at the kitchen table, chanting and being unresponsive when questioned. I apologized for messing up Mom's plans, and Carly speculated that Mom was anticipating some type of confrontation but hadn't counted on my sudden departure. We both agreed it was unexpected, and I apologized again. Changing the subject, I asked Carly about her plans. She planned to leave for school as soon as Mom settled down a little, hoping to pick up a few summer session classes. I shared that I was leaving for Atlanta the next morning and promised to call her when I got back. Carly expressed that she was glad things were working out for me and believed Mom would break out of her slump soon. The training classes in Atlanta were a snap. It was mostly about putting the right information in the right block. The hardest part was overcoming my weak computer skills. I had no trouble getting a few of the young female trainees to tutor me, but found it difficult to resist their charms. They seemed disappointed in my reserve. The next 2 years flew by. Grady was quite pleased with my job performance and was generous with the raises and bonuses. I talked with Carly on a regular basis. She was doing fine in all her classes and with her social life. It was nice to see that she was dating, but as a father, I was a little anxious about the whole scene. She laughed at my concern. I never heard from Tracy. There did not appear to be any attempt on her part to contact me. I was not hiding, so if she had wanted to find me, it would not have been a problem. She sold the house and prepaid Carly's tuition with the proceeds, then left town. Tracy called Carly every few weeks, but their relationship never returned to what it was before the incident. I had to give Tracy points for trying. Carly had no idea where Tracy had relocated to and never asked. Tracy never filed for divorce. I could hold out for as long as she could. My social life was another matter. I never thought of myself as a ladies' man, but I discovered that a new persona came along with my upgraded appearance and marital freedom. I was technically still married, but under the circumstances, I didn't feel that way. Nashville was full of young ladies looking for companionship. I always made sure that they knew I was married and not looking for any type of relationship. That turned out to be a big plus with most of them, including a few who were married themselves. I was careful not to date any of the married ones. More than once, and never took them back to my apartment. It didn't matter too much with the single ones, as long as they knew that I wasn't husband material. Grady had hired 2 more guys to do what I did. I got to train them and supervise them. There was plenty of work to go around, but I got the feeling that something was in the wind. Grady approached me, expressing that we needed to talk. Despite his seriousness, what bothered me more were the words he used, the dreaded phrase wives often used when springing bad news on unsuspecting husbands. Grady chuckled at my groan. He assured me not to get too excited, mentioning it wasn't all that bad. We both laughed, but then he dropped the bomb. He said, "Daniel, I hate to say it, but you have outgrown the job." I was puzzled and asked, "What the hell does that mean?" Grady explained that I could do better than my current position, and although he had no complaints, he believed I should be thinking about moving on. Feeling a bit defensive, I asked if he was firing me, but he adamantly denied it. Instead, he clarified that he was trying to encourage me to move forward. Marcy came in with 2 cups of coffee. Unasked, she leaned over and whispered in my ear, loud enough for Grady to hear, mentioning that Grady was afraid I might steal her away. She assured me not to worry and added that if he let me go, she would go with me. Grady groaned as Marcy left the office, and the idea of her giggling lingered, sending a shiver down my spine. Grady then informed me about a job interview set up for me in Houston on Friday. American Consolidated Claims needed someone to run their national operation, specifically the appraisal section, and Grady had already spoken to them about me. I questioned why they wouldn't hire young, qualified college graduates, and Grady explained they had tried that 3 times without success. Curious about his motive, I asked, "What's in it for you?" He revealed, "In about 4 years, Marcy and I are going to be moving to Gulf Shores. ACC has agreed to buy the business when I am ready to sell." I understood that he was not doing this out of the goodness of his heart, but using me as part of a trade. He admitted, "Exactly. See, I always said you were smart." We both enjoyed another laugh at his devious but transparent attempt to take advantage of me. Thursday night, I was on my way to Houston. I didn't want to relocate, but everything that Grady said made sense. I could have flown to Houston, but decided to drive instead. American Consolidated had 3 floors in an enormous office building. They were expecting me, and I was not the least bit nervous. I knew that I was capable of doing the job, and I was ready and willing to attack anyone who dared to question my academic qualifications. Knowing that their MBA employees had flubbed the job previously gave me confidence. The first 2 interviews went great. During the third one of the yappy middle, manager started to ask about my formal business training and was immediately shut down by his boss. I smiled at the support, but was upset at the same time. I spent the last hour with the human resources director. We were discussing salary and benefits as if my acceptance was a foregone conclusion. To be honest, at that point, it was. It would be difficult not to take this job. It was lunchtime, and my host was anxious to show off the company cafeteria. The floor we were on was as big as a basketball court. Field offices lined the perimeter, and cubicles dotted most of the center. My host expressed optimism about me enjoying working there. I reciprocated, stating that I believed American Consolidated Claims looked like a top-notch organization. I mentioned the potential occasional confusion with 2 department heads named Hemingway, and clarified that I had no relatives in Houston. Unexpectedly, she brought up a distant relative named Tracy, catching me off guard. While walking, I noticed Tracy across the room. Despite her different hairstyle, she looked radiant, talking with a small group of employees. I couldn't help but stare at her as if hypnotized, and I accidentally stumbled into a mail cart, causing a small disturbance. Tracy noticed me, looking a bit surprised, and I took advantage of her confusion to quickly leave the floor. When asked if something was wrong, I explained that I wasn't paying attention and was admiring the layout of the operation. The elevator ride felt like it took forever. As we reached the cafeteria entrance, I thanked Miss Thurgood for her help and expressed my regrets about declining the offer. It was an unexpected move, and she stood with her mouth open as I quietly exited the floor and the building. I acknowledged that it was a great job and recognized that I might regret turning it down at some point. However, at that moment, being close to Tracy on a regular basis would cause more pain than I was willing to endure. I wondered why Tracy hadn't filed for divorce yet, and hoped she would take her maiden name back when she finally did. Grady was going to be pissed. I'll handle that when I get home. 12 hours later, I was back home. Interestingly enough, Grady was more apologetic than angry. He expressed regret, saying, "Sorry, Daniel. I had no idea that your ex was working at ACC." I sat across from his desk and smiled as Marcy sat down, bringing 2 cups of coffee. I reassured Grady, stating that there was no way he could have known, and it wasn't anybody's fault. I admitted if I had any balls, I would have just taken the job and faced her. "As you can see, that didn't happen," Grady responded. "That doesn't make you less of a man, Daniel. There is no way that you could come out a winner under those circumstances. I probably would have done the same thing. I am sorry if I screwed up your deal with them." Grady laughed a little, setting down his cup. "No problem, Daniel. They still want it, and the deal is still on." Things continued as they were for the next few years. Carly graduated from college and married a nice fellow from Cleveland. I managed to attend the wedding in time to give her away, but did not stay. Tracy was there, looking beautiful. It was extremely difficult to avoid her, but I did. Carly was disappointed that I did not stay for the complete day, but she said that she understood and was glad that I showed up. I was happy that Tracy got to see her only daughter get married. I started filling my spare time taking college classes. It made more sense than going to bars and picking up floozies. Most of the other night school students were older, and a few of the ladies were able and willing to fill in for the missing bar girls. Grady was happy to foot the bill for the classes. Eventually, it came time for Grady to retire, and all the terms of the sale had been finalized. Since I had expressed my reluctance to stay with ACC, Grady arranged an interview for me with a Chicago firm. Despite my reservations about going there, Grady explained that the employment package was fabulous, which seemed unusual given the competitive job market. Upon arriving at the Universal Amalgamated Insurance Building, I was taken to the 18th floor and saw the name on the door, E.M.T. Peak. To my surprise, the executive from ACC who had defended my qualifications during my interview there was there. The first 30 minutes went extremely well, but then things turned sour. Mr. Peak expressed disappointment over my sudden departure after our talk in Houston and mentioned being somewhat understanding after learning the circumstances. I apologized for running off and explained that I wasn't ready to face the alternatives that would have come with the job. Mr. Peak then questioned whether I had figured out a way to handle difficult situations better. He mentioned setting up another interview for me and asked a seemingly unrelated question about a small glass dome on Tracy, Hemingway's desk at ACC. His question about Tracy worried me, and I wondered how she related to this interview. He inquired about the purpose of the black object inside the dome, revealing Tracy's relocation to Chicago. Mr. Peak expressed the value he placed on Tracy and his intention to keep her on the team, urging me to compliment her. Feeling trapped, I explained that the black doodad was a small item I made for my wife before we separated, unsure why she kept it. Mr. Peak asked about its purpose, and I decided to end the interview, stating that he would need to get that information from Tracy. I stood up, unnerving Mr. Peak, who seemed desperate and talked faster as he steered me to Tracy's office. On her door was just her Namino title or position description. As I walked in, Peak continued talking, and I noticed Tracy at her desk, older but more beautiful than I remembered. Over the years, I found myself dwelling on the bad things she had done, and my image of her deteriorated as my hate grew. However, the fact that I still thought about her often indicated that deep down, I still loved her. I hated what she had done, but I never stopped loving her. As this turmoil filled my brain, I realized that I was standing there, shaking my head slowly from side to side. It felt like I was trying to con myself. Her voice pulled me out of my reverie. "Daniel, nobody told me that you were coming." "What are you doing here?" she asked. She started to get up, but I motioned for her to stay seated. I sat across from her, not knowing how to start the conversation. "You look good, Daniel. You look even better than you did when I saw you in Houston," she said. This was not the discussion I was anticipating. How was I supposed to react to that? There was no way that I was going to compliment her on her hair or dress. It was a game that I was not willing to play. Mr. Peak asked me here today so that I could explain what the doodad, as he calls it, is on your desk. Her hand instinctively went towards the glass dome, but then stopped. That's crap, Daniel, and we both know it. He offered me a job again. He was disappointed when you turned him down in Houston. I didn't respond. I just sat. I had no idea where this conversation was going to go. I wanted to talk to you, but you were gone before I could catch you. Why would you want to do that? At the time, I was still hoping that I could explain things to you. Now I know that there was nothing to explain. It was all pretty well out in the open. I found myself regretting coming to see her. I pondered how to leave without seeming like a total fool. Why should I care? She asked if I ever wanted an explanation. There was one thing that piqued my curiosity. In her look, inviting me to continue, she inquired why I kept the little alarm. I explained that it reminded me of how stupid I was, looking at it and knowing that one mistake could ruin a whole lifetime. When I mentioned she only slept with him one time, she clarified that it was not what she meant. I asked Tracy before I left if she could provide me with a reason that wouldn't sound like a tired old cliché. She responded that she probably couldn't, reminding her that she gave an explanation to Carly. She admitted that it was before it was too late. Curious, I asked what that meant. She explained that at the time Carly confronted her, nothing had happened, and she just sat and looked at Carly. The conversation was not going the way I wanted it to go. Somehow or other, I was going to have to listen to her tell me about what happened and why. I didn't want to know. If she was going to insist, I was going to demand the Reader's Digest version. I didn't want all the details. She went on to reveal that up until about 6 weeks before I left, all Todd and she did was spend time together. They had lunch and saw a few movies. Todd knew what she was doing and agreed to help her. None of this was his fault. In confusion, I asked, "What the hell are you talking about?" She clarified, "It was a plan, Daniel. It was a plan that I set up to make you jealous. Well, not to actually make you jealous, but to make you pay attention." Perplexed, I asked again what she was talking about. She explained that she was buying me flowers and things, going out to eat regularly, doing everything she thought I wanted her to do. I was telling her it was all her fault, which wasn't what she was looking for. I sat without speaking. She mentioned that it was never my fault, and that she hadn't thought about it until after I left. She realized what she had done and how wrong she was. Tracy was babbling. I questioned, asking, "What the hell are you talking about?" She decided to start at the beginning, mentioning when Todd started at the company. She immediately noticed him. He was well-dressed, well-groomed, and well-mannered, everything that I was not. I asked if that was when she decided she wanted him. She clarified that it was when she decided she wanted me to be like he was. It was always me, not him. She wanted me to look like him and act like him, just like I do now. I questioned, "Okay, then what happened?" She explained that she knew it was bad in a marriage for one spouse to try to change the other. A good marriage depended on each partner accepting the other as they were. If she tried to change me, the marriage might go to hell, but if I decided to change myself, it would be okay. I remarked, "Okay, that is the first thing you said that makes sense." She continued, sharing that when she started to openly spend time with Todd, it was so that I would notice. Either I would confront her about it or figure it out for myself and take action. I questioned, "Take action? What does that mean?" She clarified, hoping that I would get a haircut, a regular one like I have, now hoping that I would start dressing better and being a little more attentive. It never worked, and she never knew why. She acknowledged that Carly figured it out and confronted her. Carly didn't know why, but she did know what she was doing. Todd and she still had not had lovemaking, so she didn't feel really guilty, but she was a little annoyed that Carly questioned her. She admitted she was wrong. She confessed to screwing up with her husband and her daughter. I asked if she had lovemaking with him, and she admitted, yes. It wasn't his fault, it was hers. She knew it took two people, and he could have stopped it, but he didn't. I sat silent, not knowing what to say, having no more questions at the moment. About 2 weeks after Carly confronted her, Todd and she were alone at his apartment, drinking wine, which she acknowledged was bad for her. She was feeling miserable that I hadn't figured it out yet. One thing led to another and they ended up in bed. Drunken lovemaking isn't very good, but it is lovemaking. They avoided each other for 2 weeks after that. She was a real mess at home, blaming what happened on me. I could have stopped it if I cared. She had lovemaking with another man because her husband didn't care about her. It was stupid, but I didn't end it. She was depressed and talked to Todd a week later. They were having lovemaking regularly, and the next week I finally caught them, but it was too late. She expressed regret for being slow, thinking everything would have been fine if she had figured it out sooner. I was being a smartass, and she remarked that it didn't suit me. It was time to go. I sat quietly for a moment, trying to come up with some clever repartee that never materialized. What I did to Todd was cruel and unnecessary, she said. She questioned why it was cruel, emphasizing that Todd never did anything to deserve it. He never tried to seduce her or disrespected me in any fashion. She expressed that Todd never attempted to take her away, questioning whether he had intentions of breaking up our marriage. She asserted that Todd only did what she had asked him to do, acknowledging that he made a few bad judgment calls. As a consequence, Todd now has to walk with a cane for the rest of his life. In her perspective, she expressed that it was not fair, Daniel. I responded, expressing that she should try walking a mile in my shoes before making such a statement. I mentioned that my response was as clever as I could manage on short notice. As I stood, I noticed tears welling up in her eyes. As I walked out the door, I heard an audible sob. 8 hours later, I was back in Nashville. Needless to say, Grady was disappointed when I gave him the news. However, he did have a very nice severance package for me. I called Carly and shared the details of the conversation with her mother. I suggested that she make an effort to contact her, but she didn't seem too responsive. A week later, I left Tennessee with a new pickup and a comfortable bankroll. I ended up in Yuba City. Merrill Kohout had decided to sell his auto body shop and move to Hawaii. I knew the business and was confident that I could run the operation and still send Merrill and his wife a nice little retirement check every month. It was a clean operation just outside of town and included a small 2-bedroom cottage in the back. It was all that I needed. 10 men came with the business. I kept 6 and let the slackers go. I could pick up some new ones as I went along. I was going to burn all those damn suits that I had accumulated, but I ended up giving them to the Salvation Army. They had a job interview program set up, and the suits would come in handy for somebody who needed them. My mustache grew back with vigor. It seemed to be happy to be released from the constraints that it had been forced to live with over the past few years. In no time, my hair was long enough to tie back. "Look out, Willie Nelson here comes." Daniel Hemingway. The business flourished, and I felt like my old self. Things were going great until the week before Christmas. When I arrived at work that morning, there was a small wrapped package on my desk. I looked at it for a moment and called my foreman in. "What the hell is this?" "Don't know, boss. A lady came in early this morning and left it there. She said that she would be back at lunchtime." I sat for a long time without touching it. I knew what was in the damn box. There was no doubt in my mind. What I didn't know was what I was going to do after I opened it. I got a hot cup of black coffee and stared at the box for a few more minutes and then started to unwrap it. For some strange reason, I was being careful not to tear the paper. My foreman came back in and saw me holding the black plastic object with about 20 little holes in it. "What the hell is that, boss?" I set it down and leaned back in my chair. "I'll tell you after lunch."
Story 2.
1 year after my dad left, my mom got engaged to a man who didn't want me to move with them, and now she expects me to give up my inheritance for him. Hey everyone, this is my first ever time posting on Reddit, and I really need you guys to advise me because I'm lost. So, I just turned 15 3 days ago, and my grandma gave me a really special, wonderful gift. She transferred the ownership of her penthouse apartment to me. My grandma doesn't live there. She lives in the suburbs but has owned the apartment for a couple of years and stays there occasionally when she wants to be close to the city. I was really thrilled because so far this past year and a half has sort of been terrible for me. First, my dad walked out on our family. He always had been a bit of a workaholic and never had time for me or my mom, but even then, this still came as a huge shock to me. My mother didn't even tell me about it until my dad moved out of the house silently almost a year back. Apparently, they had filed for divorce already by the time they told me about it, and my parents had decided that they couldn't live together anymore because my dad was just too overwhelmed with everything. What exactly was overwhelming him? I had no idea. He didn't even say goodbye to me in person. He texted me one last time after he moved out and told me to be good. That was it. I didn't see him after that, and soon enough, my parents were separated. Since my state doesn't have a long waiting period, my mother got to keep the house and had full custody of my brother and me. My dad did have visiting rights, but he hasn't put them to use so far, so I don't know what's up with that. And as if that wasn't bad enough, about 2 months ago, my mother told me that she had been dating this guy, let's call him Robert, for almost 3 months. They were in love, and she did not want to waste her time since she was not getting any younger, and that's why they had gotten engaged. I barely had any time to process that my mother was seeing somebody new when she told me that she was engaged and this person was going to be my stepdad. It was just a lot to take in, And I was really not happy about it because I thought 5 months was too little time to get to know what kind of person her fiancé was. But she told me not to worry about it. She introduced me to him 2 weeks later, and he seemed really closed off and aloof with me. However, he behaved quite differently with my brother and was very playful with him. At the time, I only thought it was because my brother was just 4 years old, so it was probably easier to be more playful with him. But a couple of weeks later, my mother told me something that completely changed my perspective of both of them. So 2 weeks back, my mother told me to sit down with her and informed me that the reason her fiancé and she got engaged so quickly was because he had been offered a really great position, and he was about to take it up. But for that, they would have to move away and live out of state. So they intended on leaving me here with my grandmother because she didn't think that I would want to leave everything behind with them. However, I told her that I would be fine with moving away if it meant that I would get to stay with my mom because I had already had my dad walk out on me, and I didn't want the same with my mother as well. But she tried to convince me that it was a bad idea because my school was here, all my friends were here, and I was happier here. But I insisted on accompanying her. Eventually, she just blurted it out. She wanted me to stay back because Robert only wanted my brother to come along with them because he was young and he could still build a good relationship with him. But I was too old, and I would never be his daughter in the true sense. And apparently he had not liked the fact that I had tried to tell my mother that 5 months was too quick to be engaged to somebody she didn't even know properly. He thought that I was still stuck mentally in the time that my mother and my father were married and wouldn't be able to adjust to him, and my mother believed the same. Which is why she wanted me to stay and figure out my life on my own. I was really hurt by this opinion of hers because if nobody else, at least I expected my mother to be on my side and not abandon me just because Robert wanted her to. It's not that I had any issue living with my grandmother. She's a wonderful person and I really love her, but I also love my mom, so I was really hurt. I tried to argue with her, but it was just not worth it. So, I told her that I didn't want to wait until they moved away. I wanted to move in with my grandmother that day itself. Of course, it was not possible for the move to be arranged that day, but within a few days, I was packed and ready to move out. My mother tried to convince me that she still loved me, but this was just her looking out for herself because she really loved me, and she wanted to give herself a shot at happiness. For the last couple of days I spent at home, I did not even speak to my mother, and I did not even say goodbye to her on the day that I left. To be honest, I did not think that it was worth it. The only person that I actually said goodbye to was my little brother because I was definitely going to miss him. Anyway, since then, I have been living with my grandma, and she has been very empathetic. My grandma, for the record, is my mother's mom. I have absolutely no relationship with my other grandparents, which is not surprising because they barely even had a relationship with my father. She has been exceptionally kind and caring, and life has been pretty easy so far with her because she really seems to love me, and she thinks that what my mother is doing is horrible. And apart from the time that it takes for me to get to and back from school, everything is pretty great here. I keep in touch with my brother, and I call my mom every evening just to speak to him. We don't speak to each other even then. And then, 3 days back, I celebrated my birthday at home. To be fair, I did not organize the party, it was my grandma. She invited a couple of my close friends from school by stalking me on Facebook and some selective relatives. It was a huge surprise to me, and it kind of cheered me up because I had been feeling really low after my mother dropped me off here. After we cut the cake, though, my grandmother announced the gift that she had for me, and that was a huge surprise. She told me that for now, her lawyer is going to act as the trustee for the property, but as soon as I turn 18, it's all mine. That was the best bit of news that I had received in quite some time, and I had no intention of sharing it with my mother. But yesterday, I got to know that she had been told about this gift that I received from my grandmother, probably by someone at the party. I don't know who, and it doesn't matter now, but I was really annoyed when she called me up last evening to tell me that she had heard about the gift that my grandmother was giving me. After speaking to Robert, they had decided that he wanted to adopt me as long as I convinced my grandmother to transfer the ownership of that property to him. I don't know why, but she actually expected me to be happy about this news because now I could finally come along with them. I was actually not happy at all, and I told her that I would not be doing anything of this sort and there was no need for her to call me anymore. Then I hung up, but she called me again after a couple of minutes, but this time I didn't even pick up. So then she texted me, and here is the text that she sent. I'm really sorry if you felt bad that I was trying to play by Robert's rules and live life on his terms. But you need to understand that after your dad and I got divorced, He was the only person who was really there for me. Of course, I had my family to support me, but that's different. He was there for me emotionally and even financially. You don't know about it because I have never let you feel it or even spoken to you about it, because I don't want you to think negatively of your father, but he's not exactly a very generous man. The settlement and alimony that I'm receiving from him is absolutely dismal, and the child support is ridiculously low. And I hope you haven't forgotten that your father was actually the primary breadwinner of our family, not me. I'm lucky that he left the house to me because otherwise I probably wouldn't even have been able to afford rent. Our lifestyle has always been very expensive, you know that. I never had to worry about money when I was with your father, but after he left, things changed, and I couldn't let you feel that. But even after picking up extra shifts at work, I couldn't match your father's income. When I started dating Robert, he was the one who was there for me. He was the one who stepped up. And I know that he has not exactly been kind to you, but that's just because he has had past relationships where children have become a bone of contention and eventually led to a breakup. We have to think about this trauma as well. And also I knew that my mother would definitely take great care of you, so I knew that I was leaving you in good hands. It's not like I actually abandoned you. You were living with your grandmother, and even you know that she never would have let you feel alone. I just wish that you were able to think about my happiness. And now that I have arranged for you to come with us, I want you to take us up on that offer and do what Robert expects of you so that the two of us can be together at least. Even your brother misses you a lot. I know that you're angry, but I also know that you love me and I love you, so reply soon. I love you. That message did give me a pause, but that last part really got under my skin because just because she wanted to do everything that Robert asked her to, she expected me to do the same as well. It was ridiculous, entitled, and weak, and I thought that my mother had lost all individuality. So even though that message initially softened me, it eventually just left a bitter taste in my mouth. So I replied to her after half an hour and told her that I would not do anything that Robert had asked me to, and she could move away with him and leave me with my grandmother like she initially planned on doing. I had nothing more to say to her because, honestly, her behavior was very disappointing. And when I spoke to my grandmother about it, she told me that no matter what happens, she's not transferring the ownership of that property to Robert because she barely even knows the guy, and she definitely does not trust him. She was pretty sure he would just sell that apartment, and I wouldn't even get a single dime out of it. So, in a way, it's good that I did not agree to my mother's proposition. However, she was not going to take no for an answer. This morning, she showed up at my grandma's place with my brother. Luckily, I was at school when she came by, and as soon as I saw her when I entered the living room, my grandmother wasted no time filling me in on the purpose of my mother's visit. My grandma told me that she was here to talk to me in person about the proposition that she had suggested last night and I had ignored. So, I clarified that I had not ignored anything. I had indeed replied to my mother's message, and I had been very clear about what I wanted. I wanted her to stick to her initial plan because I was not going to convince my grandmother to transfer the property to Robert because we did not trust him, and I have been very clear about it. So, I did not know why she was still confused. I was very curt and had a big-time tone, but can you even blame me? Anyway, my mother started crying and said that she was just trying to make everyone happy, but no matter how hard she tried, it just didn't work. I got really pissed off that she was sitting here in the living room crying when it should actually be me because, if anything, I have been the one who's been treated like absolute crap by both my parents. So, I told her to cut it out and said that she had it totally backward. She wasn't trying to make everyone happy, she was just trying to make herself happy and expected everyone to bend over backward just for that. And maybe everyone else was willing to do that, but not me. I had a life ahead of me, and I was not going to ruin it by running after her, trying to make sure that she was all right. That caught her by surprise, and soon after she left. Later on, I realized that she had blocked me, and now I feel kind of guilty about what I said. So I want to ask Ida for telling my mother that she was selfish and only cared about her happiness? Update 1. Hi everyone. So first of all, before I begin, I just want to thank everyone who took the time to comment on my original post. It really opened my eyes, and yeah, I guess there are a lot of points that I did not consider before. It hadn't even occurred to me that my mother's relationship with Robert had been going on since even before the divorce. She might just be telling us about it now because it's easier and more convenient for her since the divorce is done with, and we would be none the wiser. Honestly, the reason I hadn't thought about it was because no matter what, I couldn't imagine my mother to be a cheater, but now I'm honestly not sure. She could be for all I know. Anyway, That's really none of my business anymore because she has made it sufficiently clear that she wants nothing to do with me. The only way it's inconveniencing me is because I can't speak to my brother anymore, and I miss him. He and I always got along really well, and I hate to think that he might be Robert's kid, like a lot of you have suggested. I'm trying not to think about it, but now that people have started talking about it, it's very hard for me to ignore. I really do want to find out the truth, but I'm scared. I have discussed these possibilities with my grandmother at length for the past couple of days after I made that post. And while we have not been able to come to a conclusion about what is the truth, it has become very difficult for us to think about my mother in the same way. I feel like talking to my father about this might give us a lot of insight, but I don't even know if he would want to discuss this with us. So far, it's been 4 days since my mother visited us, and we have had no contact with her since then. On the first day, my mother had blocked me, but later on, my grandmother told me that she had blocked her as well. It's kind of ungrateful of her. To be fair to my grandmother, she has been taking care of me without even expecting my mother to pay her child support because my grandmother has money of her own. It's out of pure kindness and love for me that my grandmother is taking care of me. I can't imagine anybody giving up their time of relaxation after their retirement to take care of their grandkids, but my grandmother is doing exactly that, and I feel like my mother should be grateful for that, but instead, she has blocked her. There are just a lot of things that I'm angry with my mother about, and there are a lot of questions that I still have no answers to. I'm just really hoping that eventually it will all come out in the open. Update 2. Hey everyone, so this is going to be a bit of a long update because today around the evening my father came by to visit. My grandmother had apparently contacted him, but she hadn't told me about it because she wasn't even sure if he would come by, and she did not want to give me false hopes. Anyway, he did visit as soon as he found out that my mother was engaged to Robert. There have been a lot of revelations, and I'm still trying to process them, but I will try to talk about it here. I was quite surprised to see him, but even more surprised when he hugged me and told me that he was really sorry about everything. Eventually, he sat me down and started telling my grandmother and me everything that he knew. He told me that he and my mother had started falling out of love a really long time ago. But they had stayed together for the sake of my happiness, because they didn't want to break up this family and put me through the trouble of coming from a broken home. And then, about 3 years ago, my dad started an affair with a coworker. He really wanted to tell my mother about it, but never found the courage to do so. Eventually, she found out about it herself about a year ago, and that was when she filed for divorce. She told him that she would keep quiet about it only if he stayed away from us. She set forth a bunch of conditions, like he would leave the house to her entirely, and that she would have full custody. And even though he would have visitation rights, he would not be allowed to visit us until she said she was fine with it. She had also demanded an exorbitant amount of settlement, alimony, and child support, and he had agreed to all of it. The only thing that he wanted in return was that she would keep his affair a secret and never tell me anything about it because he didn't want me to hate him and think of him as a cheater. So far, she had held her end of the deal, but it had come at the cost of having a relationship with me. He also apologized to me for always being a workaholic and never doing enough to build a bond with me. But in his defense, it was my mother who always wanted more, and that's why he was forced to work all the time. Because the kind of lifestyle that she wanted, he couldn't afford that unless he was slogging day and night. He told me that it was not an excuse, but even then, he wanted me to know that it was not entirely his fault. I kind of understand, but it's still difficult for me to come to terms with it. But anyway, he told me the reason he had broken his promise to my mother and came to see me without asking her first was that in the message that my grandmother had left him, she had mentioned Robert by name and said that she wanted to ask if my dad knew him. So, that's why he had rushed to come over, because apparently, not only did he know Robert, but he also knew exactly what kind of person he was and had come by to warn us about him. Apparently, my mother, my dad, and Robert had all been part of the same circle in college. My parents had been together, but Robert had always had a crush on my mother. And on the night before graduation, they had all been out drinking, and Robert had confessed his feelings to my mother. At the time, my mom was with my dad, so she obviously rejected his advances, but she didn't tell my father about any of it until 2 weeks later. And then, she told him that she was confused about her feelings, so they went on a break. My dad told me that they were on a break for almost 2 months, and in the meantime, he had a couple of friends who said that she had gone out on a date with Robert, but it did not go well, and eventually she came back to him. Once they patched things up, my dad told her that he didn't want her speaking to Robert again because that would make him uncomfortable, and for a while she agreed. However, later that year, he found out that she had never cut him off, and that led to a huge fight, after which they almost broke up. But then, Robert visited my dad's apartment after that fight, and they ended up in a physical brawl because Robert thought that it was what was going to impress my mother. Instead, she got mad at him for being violent, especially after she had already told him that she just wanted to be friends with him and nothing more. So eventually, she cut him off. My dad told me that Robert had always been unhinged and had never been up to any good. After my mother cut him off after college, he moved away, and nobody heard from him for years. But now, he thinks that my mother and Robert must have reconnected a couple of years back because she had mentioned hearing from a couple of friends that he was back in the city. He wasn't sure exactly at what point my mother started speaking to Robert again, but if they were engaged, then that definitely meant that she had also been cheating on him. And all the conditions that she had set were null and void. My dad told me that he's going to confront my mother, but before he did that, I wanted to speak to her and get to the bottom of what was going on. So, he has promised me that he's going to wait for that, and after I'm done speaking to my mother and hearing her out, he is free to do whatever he wants. I'm still trying to process all of this, so it's complicated in my head because I really don't know who to believe. Neither of my parents has been good to me, and it's just really messy. Update 3. So, I finally spoke to my mother, and I did not tell her about my meeting with my father. I just wanted to talk to her independently and see what she had to say. She had blocked me, so I had no other choice but to visit her and show up unannounced. 3 days ago, my dad visited me, and yesterday, I finally worked up the courage to talk to my mother. She seemed surprised to see me at the door but still invited me in. Thankfully, Robert was not at home at the time, so I could make myself comfortable and speak to her freely. Initially, I apologized to her, but that was just for show so she would talk to me openly. I beat around the bush for a while and told her that I was just finding it very difficult to accept Robert into our family so soon. And that's why I had been acting out. And then, I got down to business. I hinted to her that I had been thinking about it, and it just didn't add up that my mother had met someone as wonderful as Robert so soon after her divorce. It just seemed to be really convenient. That was the perfect opportunity for her to come clean about the truth that she had known Robert from her college days, but she didn't say that. She just told me that she was really lucky to have found him, and that was it. I knew for a fact that my dad was telling the truth about all three of them being friends since college since he had pictures. The only thing that I was doubtful about was the authenticity of the story that he had told me about the three of them. But as soon as my mother lied to me point blank about never having known him earlier, I knew who to trust. But then, my mother decided to make it worse for herself by telling me that she had never intended to let me know about it. But the reason she had rushed into this engagement with Robert and agreed to move away with him was because she just really wanted to forget all about my father and every trace of him from her life. And then she told me about his affair, the one thing that she had made my father sacrifice everything for, and promised him that she would never let me know. After that, I did not see any reason for me to sit around and talk to her. I just told her that I would see her later and then left. As soon as I was out of there, I called my father up and told him that he was free to do whatever he wanted to do because now I knew the truth, and I knew that my dad was not lying about anything that he said. So now, my mother is going to finally get hit back by karma. I'm not saying that my dad is suddenly absolved of everything, but at least he's not as bad as my mom. Update 4. Hey everyone, so I have many things to talk about. Firstly, everyone was concerned about whether my brother was my dad's kid or not, and frankly speaking, I was too. But last month, after my dad confronted my mother, they had a paternity test conducted, and thankfully, my brother is indeed my dad's kid. So now, my dad is fighting for full custody, and since I'm 15, I can just say that I want him to have full custody, and they'll take that into account. However, I'm still living with my grandmother because even though my dad is trying to fix things, there are still many issues that we have to work on, and until then, I just want to live with my grandmother because I'm always sure of her. My mother was furious when she found out that my visit to her had only been with the purpose of finding out the truth about her and Robert, and since then, she had only unblocked me once to curse me out and then blocked me again, and we haven't spoken since. As for Robert, he dumped my mother as quickly as he had gotten engaged to her, as soon as he found out that my dad was fighting to get the alimony and child support reduced apparently. He had been lying to my mother all along because there really was no job offer. His plan had been to join his uncle in his business, which already wasn't doing too well, and he was going to use my mother's money to fund that. And obviously, that was the only reason he was asking my mother to convince me to transfer the property that my grandmother had gifted to me. They had been together for the past 2 years, and he had been stringing her along for all of it. So basically, my mother got screwed over, and instead of being ashamed of it, she has been telling all her friends about it just to badmouth Robert, but she doesn't realize that her friends have been gossiping about her, and that's how my dad found out, and eventually I did as well. I'm just really thankful that my mother decided that she wanted nothing to do with me as soon as Robert said the word, because I would hate to be stuck with her right now. Anyway, my dad and I have decided that we are going to try and work on our relationship, and he has promised me that he's going to try and be a better father to me from now onwards. And as soon as he manages to get full custody or even shared custody of my brother, we are going to try and be a happy and functional family. I don't know about the functional bit, but the least we can do is try to be happy.
Story 3.
The entire episode kicked off when I ventured into an unfamiliar place. Having dropped off one of our more bothersome clients at the airport, enduring a morning filled with his complaints, I felt no rush to return to the office. Given the dreary Tuesday and the prospect of an afternoon reviewing contracts, I decided to stop at a drab-looking bar restaurant about a mile from the airport. The plan was to enjoy a leisurely lunch and a beer or two before heading back to work in the salt mines. Seated in a booth, savoring my beer and contemplating the challenge of finding a decent burger in this world, my attention was captured by a couple entering the restaurant. Observing as they settled into a booth across the room, sitting side by side, I couldn't help but notice the woman, a shapely blonde in a short skirt showcasing her attractive legs, paired with a tight pink short-sleeve top. Her companion seemed like a thug wannabe, struggling to pull off the look in skinny jeans and a black leather jacket. My heightened interest in this seemingly happy couple becomes clear when I reveal that the woman was Shelley, my sister-in-law, and the guy with her was undoubtedly not her husband, my brother Dave. Worse still, it was evident they were more than casual acquaintances. They placed their drink orders with the waitress and immediately engaged in unrestrained displays of affection, necking in the booth. Shocked, I watched as the guy slid his hand up her thigh under the short skirt. Shelley broke their kiss, letting her head fall back against the booth, sighing. The question wasn't whether I would address this situation. That was a given. The real dilemma was whether I could restrain myself from confronting them violently right there in the restaurant. I had never been fond of Shelley, disliking her from the time my brother started dating her. My pessimism persisted when he fell head over heels in love with her and announced their marriage just 4 months into the relationship. Dave, at 23, seemed unaware of what he was getting into. However, there was simply no way to convey to him that Shelley was everything to him. To me, she was a pretty, cheerful, somewhat shallow and selfish girl, not nearly as smart or interesting as Dave himself. They both seemed to adore the same person, Shelley. He would do anything for her, and that's exactly what she liked. To my pleasant surprise, the first 3 years of their marriage appeared to be very happy. However, the scene unfolding 30 feet from me suggested that the happy days were over. The guy she was with now had his hand on Shelley's waist, kissing her neck as he worked her over. With her eyes closed, she didn't see me approach and was startled when I sat down across the table from them, casually greeting Shelley. The comical moment unfolded as her eyes popped open, and her boyfriend pulled his hands off her, turning to look at me. Her face went from momentarily startled to stunned and then truly shocked. Her jaw dropped, and she froze, staring blankly at me. His face held the same startled look, momentarily, before turning annoyed. Before he could speak, I continued in a cordial manner, inquiring about how she'd been and asking about Dave. Turning to him and extending my hand, I introduced myself as Will, Shelley's brother-in-law, emphasizing the connection to her husband, Dave. His eyes widened, and he sat frozen. Ignoring my hand, Shelley began to recover herself, babbling about Robbie being an old friend. With a friendly smile, I casually remarked on the relationship situation they were caught in, leaving Shelley gasping and hoping I hadn't witnessed their activities. Robbie abruptly stood up and muttered that he had to leave. Without even a glance back at Shelley, he walked swiftly out of the restaurant. Later, I casually remarked to Shelley that Robbie seemed like a nice guy and questioned why he left so suddenly. Internally, I seethed with rage at the treatment my brother Dave was receiving from this woman. Expressing my frustration, I kept my voice down, but made it clear that Dave adored Shelley, doing everything for her. However, it wasn't enough for her, as she engaged in illicit activities with a questionable individual sporting greasy hair and a poorly executed Matt Dillon mustache. Shelley looked terrified, her face turning pale. In response to my accusations, she stammered, trying to explain, but her voice trailed off without a conclusion. After observing her for a minute, I unleashed my anger, expressing disappointment at her actions. I questioned how long this had been going on and how many others she was involved with. Shelley pleaded, grabbing my hand desperately, and begged me not to tell Dave. Despite her pleas, I considered informing my brother about his wife's infidelity. I questioned whether he deserved to know the truth about the person he was married to. Shelley was either incredibly naive or too stunned to think clearly. I pulled my hand free, contemplating whether I should reveal the painful truth to Dave. Her eyes were wild, and she seemed to be thinking frantically. I sat back with a smile, curious about what she would offer to keep me silent. Shelley, after some contemplation, changed her expression. She pleaded with me not to tell Dave, promising to reveal the entire story. According to her, she claimed that another woman, someone I was involved with, was cheating on me. I laughed at the seemingly far-fetched revelation. Shelley looked at me steadily, insisting that she wasn't kidding. According to her, the other woman had been seeing a guy from the health club for at least a couple of weeks. This certainty unsettled me, even though I knew it to be impossible. We had been together for 7 happy years of marriage and a decade overall. She was devoted, sensible, kind, thoughtful, and the most honest person I knew. She loved me, and I was sure of it, just as sure as I was of my own love for her. Shelley leaned forward, sensing my confusion. She claimed to be telling the truth, mentioning that the other woman had confided in her about the affair the previous week. I scrutinized her face, trying to gather my thoughts. Despite her initial terror, Shelley appeared calm and in control, as if she were sharing a genuine revelation rather than spinning a wild and desperate tale. While I couldn't immediately dismiss what she was saying, it was challenging to believe given our history and her recent behavior. Seated at the dinner table, my gaze returned to Shelley, who seemed to be anticipating my next move. Although I didn't reveal it to her, concealing her infidelity from Dave was not an option. I needed to uncover the truth about him. I spoke slowly, suggesting that perhaps we could reach an agreement. After some contemplation, I expressed my unwillingness to let Anne deceive me. I proposed that if Shelley could help me gather information about Anne's actions, I wouldn't disclose what I had witnessed that afternoon to Dave. However, I laid down a condition. She had to swear not to see Robbie or any other man besides Dave. Relief washed over her face as she swore to comply. She asked, "Will you have my word on it?" I remained skeptical about the value of her word. Responding to her question, I inquired about what she would be willing to do to fulfill her part of the agreement. Expressing my desire to gather information about Anne's affair, I suggested a plan to Shelley. I proposed providing her with a tape recorder to conceal in her apartment. The idea was for her to invite Anne over, offer some wine, and engage in casual conversation, encouraging Anne to reveal details about her affair. I specified that I wanted to know the identity of the man, when and how the affair started, how often she had been with him, and the reasons behind her actions. As I spoke to Shelley, I realized that I was starting to believe her unusual story about Anne's infidelity, which infuriated me. Shelley nodded in agreement, stating that she could carry out the plan. She suggested softening Anne up by sharing the details of my own affair, making it feel like a genuine relationship conversation. Sarcastically, I questioned if Robbie was the only one who had been involved with her, or if there were others. She quickly denied any others, but I remained unconvinced. 20 minutes later, I was driving back to the office, contemplating somber thoughts about the potential end of Dave's marriage, and the looming possibility of the end of mine. My first instinct might have been to call Dave and inform him about what I had witnessed Shelley doing, but I recognized that it wasn't an option. I had always been the steady older brother, while Dave was the charming and outgoing one with a history of short-lived relationships due to his talkative nature. When Dave met Shelley, everything changed. Despite being a confident and charming individual, he became a lovesick schoolboy within a month or two. Shelley had completely captivated him, and he was determined to marry her. Dave idolized Shelley, considering her incapable of doing any wrong. Knowing Dave's unwavering devotion to Shelley, I refrained from speaking to him until I had concrete evidence. I realized that he wouldn't believe she was cheating unless he heard it directly from her. Despite my hopes that Shelley might be lying or mistaken about Anne's faithfulness to me, the likelihood diminished. The possibility that Shelley could have lied to me out of desperation crossed my mind, but I also considered the consequences of discovering it was all a fabrication. When I arrived at my office, I took out a pad and made notes on the steps I would have to take if the worst turned out to be true. This included considerations about credit cards, selling the house, transferring car titles, and more. I hoped that in a few days, I would be able to discard that sheet of paper. When I arrived home for dinner, cheerfully humming in the kitchen as she set the table, she greeted me with a big hug and a kiss, appearing as the loving wife I'd usually be happy to see at the end of the day. Despite my suspicions, cultivated over the past 7 years, I knew I had to play the innocent husband for a few more days. Underneath the surface, I felt a mix of fury and hurt, unsure of how to process my emotions. We chatted amicably during dinner, but when she mentioned her workout at the health club during dessert, I couldn't resist a bit of probing. I casually remarked to Shelley, commenting on her recent dedication to workouts. I asked if the club was now offering free ice cream. She laughed, though I noticed a slight flush on her face. She explained that she had been enjoying the positive feeling of a good, sweaty workout and coming home to her loving husband. She also mentioned that a few weeks ago, the black slacks I liked were starting to feel tight, but now they fit perfectly. She beamed affectionately, and despite my concerns about her fidelity, I couldn't help but appreciate her beauty and my love for her. If she were truly cheating on me, I couldn't help but feel conflicted and unsure of how to navigate the situation. Despite what the court calendar officially stated, my marriage ended exactly 1 week later, on another Tuesday. Shelley and I had orchestrated everything. I provided her with a small tape recorder to hide in her living room, and she arranged for Anne to drop by for lunch on a Tuesday afternoon when Anne had a day off from work. Shelley, who didn't have a job, kept me on edge throughout that afternoon in my office, pretending to work, contemplating what the women were discussing and its potential impact on my life at 430. When Shelley called and informed me that they were done and Anne had left, my heart sank. Desperately hoping for a different outcome, I asked if Anne had talked to her about it. Shelley, sounding a little drunk, giggled affirmatively. She shared that she had told Anne about Robbie, and Anne, in turn, disclosed details about Marion, emphasizing that he was a really big fella. Feeling the tension, I realized I was squeezing the phone so tightly that my fingers ached. I agreed to drop by in 20 minutes. When I reached Shelley's place, she handed me the tape recorder at the door. Reminding me of the promise I made not to disclose anything, I assured her that he wouldn't hear a word from me. I emphasized the importance of ensuring that Anne never found out about the recording, as she might become furious and potentially tell Dave. Nodding in acknowledgement, I turned and left. That evening was one of the most painful of my life. Knowing I couldn't listen to the tape until Anne was asleep, I continued pretending to be the loving husband while she was still a little tipsy. She shared that she had spent the afternoon with Shelley and had consumed a lot of wine. Additionally, she was amorous. After clearing the dinner dishes, she pulled me towards the bedroom, asking if I had a little something for her tonight. In a flirtatious tone, I questioned whether I could or even wanted to go through with it. The thought crossed my mind that it might be the last time I would ever have closeness with Anne. Still hoping, against all reason, that she might not have been unfaithful, I followed her into the bedroom, and we had lovemaking. For me, it wasn't making love. My torn heart and worried mind overshadowed any pleasure. We rested for a while in each other's arms, then repeated the act a few minutes later. Anne was fast asleep, snoring gently on her side next to me. I retreated to the guest room, closed the door behind me, and listened to the tape. The first few minutes of conversation between Shelley and Anne were breezy and casual, with Shelley keeping the wine flowing. After a while, she confessed to Anne that she had something to share. She proceeded to share the details of her affair with the a-hole Robbie. It became evident that Anne was already aware of the affair, and Shelley was merely providing her with the juicy specifics to soften her up. Shelley executed her role admirably, even confessing with a laugh that Robbie was just the latest, not the best. There had been a guy named Ellis, but unfortunately, he had moved out of town. Anne giggled and pretended to be shocked, though she appeared to be enjoying the story. The explicit details of the sleazy narrative had little effect on me. I already knew what Shelley was, and the added specifics would only make it easier to convince Dave that she had indeed cheated on him. Anxiously awaiting the inevitable, I resisted the urge to fast-forward the tape. Eventually, Shelley redirected the conversation towards Andy, expressing curiosity about my story. She giggled, mentioning that all I had shared so far was meeting him at the health club and his well-endowed nature. My body tensed as I listened to Anne's voice on the recording, laughing and describing Andy as amazing, the largest she had ever encountered. She went on to share more details, expressing initial doubts about it fitting inside her, leading to laughter from both women. Overwhelmed by the revelations, I stopped the tape and leaned back in my chair, absorbing the painful truth. My marriage was now officially over. Did I even want to hear the rest? I considered letting my lawyer listen to it. After some thought, I switched the machine back on. It was time to face the entire story, confront the anger and pain, and begin the process of figuring out what the rest of my life would look like. Shelley inquired about the beginning of the affair, asking how it started. Anne responded, explaining that she never meant to cheat on me and felt terrible about it. She mentioned our happiness together and expressed her disbelief in engaging in infidelity. She attributed it to having a bad case of BDF, which she found amusing. Laughing, Anne heard Shelley ask about BDF, and she promised to explain after having more wine. Anne continued, sharing that she had been going to the health club for a couple of years to avoid getting saggy and to maintain my interest. A few months ago, she started noticing a new trainer named Marion, describing him as hot with broad shoulders and amazing muscles. She mentioned his flirtatious behavior with women and recalled witnessing him talking quietly with Patty McAllister, a former colleague. Anne watched Patty enter Marion's office, and later, in the locker room, Patty appeared well-drilled, exhibiting a dreamy-eyed look and a vague smile. I greeted Patty and noticed her happy demeanor. She shared that she had a bad case of BTF, explaining it as big tool fever. She giggled, ensuring no one could hear her, and recounted her experiences with Marion, emphasizing his sensational qualities as a lovemaking partner and the impressive size of his tool. Patty described how Marion had flirted with her, eventually convincing her to go into his office, leading to an ongoing carnal relationship at the club. She expressed that he was incredible, providing her with the craziest lovemaking she had ever experienced. While her revelations caught my attention, I had no initial plans to take any action, considering Patty's divorce status and her freedom to play with whomever she liked. Over the next couple of weeks, my curiosity about Marion grew. I responded more attentively when he flirted with me, such as brushing against me or touching my shoulder while assisting me with the machines. During one workout session, as I performed bench presses in a nearly empty area, he stood behind me as if to spot me. Looking up, I noticed his shorts right above my head, and the sizable bulge of his package caught my attention. I couldn't believe how big and thick it looked in his shorts. He smiled down at me, aware of what I was looking at. I almost dropped the bar on my chest, but managed to finish my reps. As I put the bar back on the rack, he took my hand off the bar and slid it gently down over his shorts. His tool felt as enormous as it looked, and it was hard as a rock. Then, after a couple of minutes, he gently pulled me to my feet, looked around to ensure no one was there, and led me by the hand into his office. I wasn't thinking, kind of dazed. He locked the door behind us, sat me down in a chair, and without a word, pulled off his shorts, standing in front of me. I swear I wasn't thinking at all. We had wild lovemaking. By the time he finished, I was beside myself, exhausted, and totally spent. Shelley reacted with an impressed, "Wow," and it seemed like she genuinely meant it. She assumed that Anne had continued seeing Marion. Anne explained that after the encounter in Marion's office, she had drifted into the shower, feeling dreamy and weak in the knees. Wiped out, she cleaned up and went home, overwhelmed by guilt and fear of being discovered by me. Surprisingly, I didn't suspect anything that night, and it seemed normal. Despite my desire for closeness, she made an excuse, fearing I might notice a change. The following night, she mentioned giving me the full treatment, engaging in closeness until I couldn't continue. Anne admitted staying away from the gym for 2 weeks following the incident. I just knew I couldn't be anywhere near Marion without being tempted again. Finally, I told myself it had been a one-time thing. I was a grown woman with a wonderful husband, and I could resist him. So I started going back. And the first couple of times it was fine. Marion winked at me and flirted a little, but he left me alone. And I thought, this is okay. I'm over this. And I relaxed my guard a little. Then about a week after that, he caught me again at the bench, and the room was empty. And he got my hand on his tool, and in no time, you were back in his office. Shelley finished her sentence, expressing how much better it was. Anne, speaking somewhat dreamily, struggled to describe the experience. She conveyed her deep love for closeness with me, emphasizing our satisfaction in each other. Anne confessed that she had never been tempted to fool around before, even with a flirtatious coworker named Alex. Despite his success with other girls, Anne had remained uninterested. However, with Marion, she felt as though she had never experienced such pleasure before. Giggling, Anne acknowledged the absurdity of sharing such details, emphasizing that there was nothing particularly special about Marion. She clarified that she had no interest in him as a person or a lover. It was solely about the physical aspect. She referred to it as God's gift, prompting laughter from both her and Shelley. I listened to the two of them and felt the anger coursing in my veins. I sat through the rest of the tape, but there wasn't much more. Once he'd had lovemaking with her a second time, he gave up all attempts to resist. She'd been with him 2 to 3 times a week for nearly a month, and there was no sign she was ready to stop. In fact, she said that she'd been enjoying lovemaking with me more lately as well, perhaps because her secret was kind of a turn-on. It was clear that her BTF had overcome whatever guilt she might be feeling about betraying me. Me, the love of her life, her husband of 7 years, the man who was completely devoted to her, and who still remembered what forsaking all others was supposed to mean. It took a while to think through my plans, and it was 02:30 a.m. By the time I went to sleep in the guest room, I was done seeing and sleeping next to her, or even talking to her. I slipped into the bedroom and got clothes for the next day without waking her. At 06:30 a.m., I was up and out the door. I left a brief and cold note, trying not to reveal anything, stating that Anne had an early meeting due to my call. Apologizing for forgetting to mention it, I made 2 copies of the tape last night at the office. By 8:30, I was on the phone with my best friend from college, who worked at a downtown law firm. I requested a favor, asking him to arrange an hour with the meanest and most bloodthirsty divorce lawyer in his firm. There was a moment of silence, and he expressed shock, apologizing for the situation. After a brief conversation, Eddie showed me into the office of Margaret Adamson, a lead partner in his firm, known for her intimidating presence. Eddie had described her as someone even sharks would avoid in the ocean. Margaret's look and handshake confirmed that she meant business, and I was already relieved that she would be representing me rather than Anne. I played Margaret and Eddie part of the tape. After hearing the initial moments, Margaret instructed her assistant to hold her calls, and we listened to the rest. When it concluded, we sat in silence for a minute. Margaret then straightforwardly asked, "Okay, what do you want?" Expressing my desire for a divorce due to infidelity, I emphasized avoiding the cliché of irreconcilable differences. I mentioned being reasonable about our savings, but insisted on keeping the house. Additionally, I wanted Anne to revert to her maiden name, as I believed she no longer deserved to be Mrs. Will Harris. Margaret nodded, studying me intently, and then requested a brief break with Eddie to discuss the legal details. Within 5 minutes, I was back in Margaret's office, and she was ready to proceed. She assured me that the divorce would likely proceed smoothly with Anne accepting the terms. However, she mentioned that the tape would be inadmissible since Anne was unaware of its recording. I grimaced and disclosed the complication involving my sister-in-law Shelley's infidelity, her offer to help, and the content of the first part of the tape. I explained my intention to inform my brother, acknowledging that he would be devastated. Half ironically, I suggested Margaret consider handling my brother's divorce as well. She looked at Eddie and then back at me. We started by listening to Shelley's part of the tape, and after another huddle between Margaret and Eddie, she remarked, "Quite a pair of wives you two picked." Seeing my reaction, she apologized, acknowledging it was inappropriate. Margaret then outlined the situation, stating that the tape might not be admissible against Anne due to her unawareness, but Shelley could be subpoenaed to testify about what Anne told her. It shouldn't make much difference. Once Anne's attorney hears the tape, he won't be in much position to fight. In your brother Dave's case, the tape is admissible because Shelley knew she was being recorded, so she's got no defense whatsoever. That divorce will be easy as long as he's not totally unreasonable. Then there's the health club. We can sue both them and Marion. Marion won't have much money, presumably, but Eddie and I can pretty much guarantee you a nice big check from the club somewhere in the high six figures to $1.5 million. The tape could be used in a civil lawsuit, and there's no way in hell they would ever let this get into the newspapers. Think of all the husbands who'd be canceling their wives' club memberships. She laughed briefly, maintaining a somewhat intimidating demeanor. Margaret assured that she would initiate the divorce documents, and Eddie escorted me out of the office. He expressed his apologies, assuring me that Margaret would fulfill my requests. Despite feeling terrible about the situation, I tried to smile and reassured him, saying, "It's okay, Eddie. This just means you and I will have more time to play tennis together." I expressed my gratitude, thanked him, and left. The rest of the day I submerged myself in details. I arranged a locksmith to meet me at the house at 4:30. I made a dinner date with Dave so I wouldn't be around when Anne came home. I cut off her credit cards and arranged separate accounts for our money. And I wrote her a note. It took several tries. Not easy to say goodbye to the love of your life, even under these circumstances. When I finally finished it, I put it in an envelope, wrote Anne's name on the front, and took it home. The locksmith finished by about 5:15. I had a beer, sitting by myself quietly in the kitchen. Then I taped the note to the outside of the front door, locked it, and left. I knew Anne would be home between 6 and 6:30. I idly wondered what she'd do first. Try the door and find her key. Didn't work or read the note. Our marriage is over. Now you'll be free to play around all you want with Marion and his big tool. I've had the locks changed. If you want to get your clothing and personal things, call my attorney. I left Margaret's name and number. She'll arrange for you to have supervised access to the house. When I'm not here, I won't be talking to you again. You broke my heart. I loved you as much as any man can love a woman, and I looked forward to our growing old together. Too bad our marriage vows didn't mean as much to you as some lovemaking with a big tool, or as much as they did to me. When Dave joined me for dinner, he immediately sensed that something was amiss. After placing our orders, I took a deep breath and disclosed that Anne had been cheating on me, and I was planning to divorce her. His reaction was evident, staring at me with an open mouth, a sight I hadn't witnessed before. He expressed shock, exclaiming, "Oh my God, Will! My God, Anne! Are you sure?" Realizing the obvious, he apologized, acknowledging it as a foolish question. He could see the truth in my expression and asked if I wanted to talk about it. I did, sharing my hurt and despair with my best friend over dinner. The beers provided some comfort, but having Dave's unwavering support meant even more. Towards the end of the meal, I revealed another aspect, mentioning that there's one part of it I haven't told him. Shelley is the one who got me proof. She taped a conversation of her and Anne talking, and Anne told her the whole sorry business. Dave looked at me sympathetically, expressing his sorrow. He added that he hoped it wouldn't make me angry, but he felt lucky to have a fantastic wife like Shelley. He mentioned that he's not surprised she helped me, as she has always liked me. He acknowledged that I haven't always approved of her, but began praising her. I couldn't bear to hear more praise for Shelley, especially considering the circumstances. I interrupted him, saying, "Listen, Dave, wait. Don't say anything else. Let me pay the bill, and I need you to come back to the house with me." A note with Will written on it in a flowery handwriting was found under the screen door. Without reading it, I dropped the note on the hall table and ushered him into the guest room. I communicated the seriousness of the situation to Dave, expressing my love for him and emphasizing our friendship. He responded with a wary look, not accustomed to such conversations. I urged him to listen to a tape recorded by Shelley, instructing him to stay seated while I went to another room. Rewinding the tape to the beginning, I pushed the tape recorder toward him and left. In the subsequent moments, I heard quiet murmurs from the tape, followed by a crash. Dave, seemingly agitated, paced around while the tape continued to play until it fell into silence. Upon entering the kitchen, Dave confronted me with intense anger, accusing me of relishing in the knowledge about Shelley and deliberately keeping it from him. He berated me for allowing him to praise her without revealing the truth. He insisted that I must be enjoying the situation, accusing me of harboring a long-standing dislike for Shelley. In response, I stood up and raised my voice, questioning what I had just discovered about him. My glare intensified, and gradually, Dave's demeanor softened. His shoulders slumped, fists unclenched, and he sat down at the table, resembling an old man. After a moment, he apologized, saying, "Sorry, Will. I know you're hurting just like I am. It's just you obviously knew about this." "Why didn't you tell me, Dave?" I said as gently as I could. "You know how you were about Shelley. You would never have believed me. Remember that fight we had when I criticized something she'd said to Mom? I found out about Shelley a week ago, and I knew that I couldn't possibly tell you. You had to hear it for yourself. I only got the tape from her yesterday. The two of us emptied a few beer bottles while I told Dave the whole story. I began with seeing Shelley and Robbie at the restaurant, then the deal she offered me, the making of the tape, and my conversation with Margaret Adamson. She's handling my divorce, and she'll be happy to represent you too if you want. Our cases are pretty much a shoo-in, she says. We talked late into the night, and then Dave crashed in my guest room. He didn't have the heart to face Shelley. The phone rang several times, but we didn't answer it. And finally, I just left it off the hook. A few days went by, and then a few weeks, and kept calling for a while, leaving me messages of her crying and begging to talk to me. But I didn't answer or call her back. I just didn't see any reason to talk to her. She tried finding me at work, but I'd asked our receptionist to tip me off, and I ducked out of my office each time she showed up. A couple of times I saw her car parked in front of the house when I came home from work, so I just drove right by and stayed away for a couple of hours until she left. Margaret Adamson did her work beautifully. The divorce papers were served. She fought through all the legal maneuvers that Inn's lawyer tried to pull, and a court date was set. In his initial conversations with Margaret, he claimed that no infidelity had taken place. Once she sent him a copy of the tape, we stopped hearing that line. Instead, he pointed out that the tape was inadmissible. Margaret didn't even dignify that one with a response. She just sat tight. And as the court date approached, Ann's lawyer finally called Margaret to ask for a settlement conference. The day after listening to the tape, Dave moved out of his apartment with Shelley and into my guest room. He drove over and watched the place until she went out, then called me. The two of us packed up everything he wanted and got out of there in less than 2 hours. He told me, "I don't want to see her. I don't want to hear a word she has to say. I just want to get the hell away from her." His eyes started to tear up, and I turned away. Was it a good thing or a bad thing that I knew just how he felt? Shelley left me a couple of angry, cursing messages at home, a nice counterpoint to Ann's remorseful ones. After a day or two, I started screening the messages, deleting any from Shelley and as soon as I heard their voices, Shelley called Dave at work and sent him letters. But he never responded to them. Margaret was handling his divorce too, and he and I just sat back and let her run the show. To my amazement, the lawsuits against Marion and the health club were resolved first. The one against Marion never went anywhere. He disappeared one day and left no forwarding address. But the health club, eager to avoid negative publicity, just as Margaret had predicted, reached a $1.1 million settlement. I signed a pledge of confidentiality and walked away with the largest check I'd ever seen in less than 10 weeks. My brother was a rock, and I guess I was for him too. We lived like two bachelors, going out to eat a lot, taking in a ball game from time to time, or just sitting around and talking over a few beers. We talked about, and then Shelley, about our lives with them, about how many great women there were out there just waiting for us. It wasn't easy to believe that last bit, and yet we were really able to help each other. I could see as plain as day that there wasn't a thing wrong with Dave that led to Shelley's behavior. She was simply a selfish strumpet. Likewise, Dave reassured me that Inch cheating wasn't a reflection on me, just an indication of how screwed up SG was. Neither of us probably believed the other one all that much, but it still helped to hear it. Dave was divorced first, as it turned out. He made it clear that he wouldn't talk to Shelley under any circumstances. And so Margaret handled the whole thing. She told him that Shelley had fought for more money at first, but that with the tape, she didn't have a leg to stand on. I went into the office with him the day he had to sign the papers. Shelley had already signed them. He smiled grimly, shook Margaret's hand, and thanked her, and then went off to the men's room. I heard him crying through the door. When I went to find him 3 weeks later, it was my turn. We met on a Tuesday, and in me and the 2 lawyers, and in her lawyer had agreed to a settlement, but insisted on 2 conditions: that I drop infidelity as a reason for the divorce, and that I meet privately with, and before we signed the papers, I told Margaret I was willing to see, but not willing to drop infidelity. Eventually, we agreed that I'd give Anne a chance to persuade me. If she could do so, we'd change it to irreconcilable differences, that old standby. In a weird way, I was looking forward to hearing what Anne had to say. Maybe I'm a masochist, but I loved her for 10 years, and I couldn't really imagine simply walking away without one final conversation. When I got there and was sitting in the conference room wearing a blue dress she knew I'd always loved. Her hair was shorter, and it looked great. She was pale, but she was the same beautiful woman I had loved for so long. "Okay, Anne, it's your meeting," I said neutrally. My heart was pounding, but I tried to look calm. "Just 2 things. All right? Please don't tell me how much you love me, and don't tell me it was just love-making." She flushed, and I could see tears welling up in her eyes. "Will, I'm so sorry, but how can I not say those things? I screwed up, plain and simple. I was selfish and thoughtless, and I hurt you. But it was just love-making, nothing but a stupid, stupid impulse. I gave in to you. Can't imagine how much I've gone over it, how many times I wished I had never done it. Yes, well, but you did do it, didn't you? I had no intention of making this easy for her. Just being in the same room with her, knowing that we were about to separate for good, and why broke my heart all over again." I went to the window and gazed out, unwilling to let her see my stricken face. Behind me, I could hear her crying softly. "Baby, it was. It didn't mean anything, you know. It was the dumbest, most hurtful thing I could ever have done to you. I know that, but it meant nothing to me. It has nothing to do with how much I love you." I let her talk a bit more, listening to the pleading tone, the sweet voice I had always loved, but not hearing a single word that I couldn't have predicted. She had nothing to say to me that I didn't already know, and nothing that made a damn bit of difference. After a while, I turned around and came back to the table, sitting down directly across from her. "And just so you know, I still love you very much. But it's over between us." She started to cry again. "You took from me, from us, the most precious thing we had together. Aside from our love, the bond of trust between us. How could I ever make love to you again? Wondering if it was me you were thinking about or Marion and his freak show tool. How would I know whether you were loving me or missing him? And how could I live with you, wondering where you were every time you were 10 minutes late coming home, wondering what you were doing on your lunch hour, wondering whether you'd found another big tool to play around with?" I waited, but she had no reply to make. Finally, between the sobs, she said, "Please, baby, please. Couldn't you give me one more chance? And I'll give you a few minutes to think about this one. What if I had met some bimbo with fantastic big jugs and started bawling her on the side for a few weeks, nobody I liked or respected? Just a handsome girl who was a fantastic lay, who gave me a degree of pure physical pleasure that I never got from you. And then you found out about it. Could you stay with me? Could you get past the feelings of hurt? The sense of total betrayal? Could you overcome the doubts you'd have about your own attractiveness? The fears that you weren't ever going to be the one I really wanted?" She looked up at me with the saddest eyes I had ever seen. "Well, I don't have to think about it. I've thought about it for weeks now. Could I forgive you? Could I take you back if it were the other way around? And the answer is no, I couldn't. I just couldn't handle those feelings. I know that. So I'm asking you to do something I couldn't do, to be a braver, stronger person than I could ever be, and to give me a chance to make it up to you a lifetime, to show you how sorry I am and how much I love you." There was silence a minute, 2 minutes, as we looked at one another, both of us thinking about all we had meant to one another and how we had arrived. At this point, I stood up slowly, hating myself and hating her for cheating on me, and now for throwing it all back on me. I don't know whether I can't do it or won't do it, but I'm not that braver, stronger person you want me to be. Goodbye. And I waited by the open door for a moment, looking back, giving her a chance for the last word. She had her head down, crying. She didn't say anything else. Margaret was waiting for me down the hall, a surprisingly sympathetic look on her hard face. "Let her have irreconcilable differences," I growled. "It doesn't make a damn bit of difference to me." Dave and I sat at my kitchen table. We'd had a few, but we weren't drunk. "Listen," I said, "I've made some plans." He nodded, and I went on. "After the lawyer's fees, I still have nearly $800,000 from that settlement. I've invested all but $50,000 of it in some nice, safe places, so there will be a lovely nest egg for when we're old and feeble. But the last 50 grand has been designated to Will and Dave Harris Recovery Fund, and we're going to start spending some of it. I've rented us 4 weeks at a 2-bedroom condo in Cancun, starting 2 weeks from now. Go tell your office you're taking some time off. We are going to be a pair of fun-loving bachelors, 2 gay divorces, if you know what I mean." He just raised an eyebrow, and I laughed. "No a-hole. Gay, as in cheerful. We've done enough moping around telling each other how badly we've been screwed over. Cancun was a blast, or at least as much of one as it can be for 2 guys recovering from broken hearts. We got a lot of sun, played a lot of tennis, swam a lot, and drank a lot, though we kept one another from going off the deep end with each passing day. We got tanner, a little fitter, and slightly further from the nightmare we just lived through. And let me say, God bless my charismatic and charming brother. Despite the blow to his self-confidence that Shelley had laid on him, he got his old groove back, and we had a lot of female companionship. His favorite stunt, and damned if it didn't succeed 75% of the time, was to spot 2 attractive women sitting together. He'd drag me straight over to their table, smile winningly, and say, "Pardon me, ladies. I'm sure you wouldn't be comfortable letting a stranger buy you a drink, so let me introduce my brother, Will Harris." Then it was up to me, the shyer one, to say, "Delighted to meet you both. This is my brother, Dave Harris." Then he would step back in. "Phew, glad that's taken care of. Now, may we buy you a drink?" By this time, the women were usually at least grinning, if not laughing, and we'd mostly find ourselves with female companionship for the evening. Sometimes the companionship lasted until breakfast. After all, unattached women in Cancun were as eager for fun as we were. I had maybe 6 different women in my bed over those 4 weeks, and I imagine Dave's number was a little higher. Mostly it was fun, just laughter and pleasure, and keeping it light. The first couple of times I made love to a woman, I was tentative, distracted by thoughts of Marion and his huge tool, even though both he and were thousands of miles away. It was hard to compete with what I knew he had done to her, but the women didn't seem to notice, and being with someone new got easier each time. One-night stands may not be for everyone or for every stage in a person's life, but they seemed to be what Dave and I needed. Only one of the women was different, Shannon, a tall Irish redhead a year younger than I was. We did all the same things, had some drinks, laughed a lot, went for dinner, did some dancing, and back to my place, to bed. She was handsome and responsive, as eager to be with me as I was to be with her. We had a lot of fun. When it got different was later, around 3 a.m. For some reason, I woke up and just lay in bed, Shannon softly breathing in sleep beside me. Thoughts of and filled my head, and all that we had had together and how it had been taken from me. I started crying very quietly, and before I knew it, Shannon was kneeling beside me, holding me in her arms, saying, "Let it out, baby, it's okay." I was embarrassed, but I couldn't stop. She kept soothing me, and finally, in response to her urgings, I told her the whole story. By the time I was done, the sun was rising. We shuffled into the kitchen, and I made breakfast for us while she told me her own story. Also a divorce, no cheating, just a husband who grew ever more distant, ever more driven and career-oriented, until there was just no marriage left. She'd been on her own for nearly 2 years. After eating, we found our way back to the bedroom without a word spoken and made love. The night before had been screwing, fun, exciting, friendly, but just lovemaking. This time, We looked into each other's eyes, murmured tenderly, and found a very different level of closeness. My one-night stand with Shannon turned into 4 wonderful nights. In the afternoon, she left. My brother Dave was a little worried about me, I think. Urging me to meet new ladies, he mentioned it was time to move on. I acknowledged that one was special. He agreed, saying he liked her too. However, he reminded me that she had gone home, and we still had 10 more days to spend down here. He dragged me off to the tennis court, then the pool, and by that evening, we were chatting with 2 secretaries from San Francisco on their very first trip outside the United States. That night, they slept in their own hotel room, but the next afternoon, Barbara joined me in my room for her first ever experience on foreign soil. Dave and I went out for dinner at a steak place we both liked. It had been 8 months since Cancun. Dave had long since found a terrific apartment he liked, but we still spent a lot of time together. Just after we ordered, Dave leaned forward and mentioned quietly that across the room, 2 couples had just sat down, and one of them was her, with some guy. I appreciated the warning, and despite my sudden thumping heart, I waited a few seconds before casually turning around to look across the dance floor. She had already spotted us and was looking steadily over at me. I gave her a friendly, non-committal smile and a wave, and she smiled back. Then, I forced myself to turn around and chat some more with my brother. He inquired if this was the first time I had seen her since the divorce, and I nodded. I admitted that I didn't think I'd have this much of a reaction, but the surprise had something to do with it. I suggested to Dave that he do me a favor. Let's enjoy our dinner and not tell me anything about what she's doing over there, how she looks. I didn't want to know. Dave agreed, saying that it's fine, and then he launched into a funny story about a coworker who had been flirting with him for a couple of weeks. While he wasn't terribly interested in her, he was enjoying the game. While enjoying our coffees and casually observing the dancing couples, I felt a hand on my shoulder and heard that familiar voice inquiring about my well-being. Rising from my seat, I gazed into Anne's eyes and offered a greeting, once again caught off guard. She suggested a dance for old time's sake, and I agreed willingly. As we danced, memories flooded back. Her warmth in my arms, her beauty, and the nostalgia for happier times. Amidst discussing mundane topics like our jobs and the weather, we eventually lapsed into silence. Lost in the emotions of holding her again, I reflected on the dances we shared and the realization that those moments were now memories. Towards the end of the dance, Anne pulled back to look into my eyes and inquired about my well-being. Despite not owing her any honesty, I decided to share my feelings. I expressed that I was all right, pretty good, I guessed. Some days were better than others. Seeing her that night, dancing together, was powerful, and I didn't know I would feel this much. Anne, with a serious expression, confessed that she wasn't so all right. She missed me every day, and being in my arms again had a profound effect on her. Unsure of how to respond, I remained silent as the music played its last chords. Anne hesitated to let me go and shared a thought. Had I ever wondered if I made the right decision? She admitted that she still thought about us all the time, but usually didn't get much past wondering why I made the wrong decision. Later, when I dropped Dave off, he expressed concern about my well-being. I reassured him, acknowledging the inevitability of such encounters in a small town. Confirming our tennis plans for the next day, I headed home. In the dim bedroom, as I undressed quietly, she rolled over towards me and inquired about my evening with Dave. I shared the strangeness of the encounter, contemplating that it might have been for the best that she hadn't joined. She responded with a loving smile, proposing that I hold her for a few minutes. Embracing, I felt her tender kisses along the side of my neck, savoring her familiar scent.
Story 4.
Before the events that changed my life, my world revolved around the comforting regularity of small-town life. I grew up in a house that seemed to have a story for every creak of its wooden floors and every mark on its walls. My father built it from the ground up, brick by brick, pouring his soul into every detail. He always said, "A home is only as strong as the effort you put into it." That sentiment stuck with me through the years, influencing the way I approached everything: my career, my relationships, and my future. My love for electronics started when I was 10, tinkering in the workshop my dad set up in the basement. Those hours spent dismantling radios and repairing outdated TVs taught me more than just technical skills. They showed me the joy of solving problems. I thought the world was as straightforward as circuits and wiring. Follow the connections and you'll find the answers. But life has a way of throwing in complications no schematic could predict. The jury had just begun deliberations after hearing the final arguments from both sides. It was already late in the afternoon, around 4 p.m., so the judge decided to send the jury back to their hotel, where they had been sequestered throughout the 2-week trial. The case marked the end of an investigation that had stretched on for nearly a year. The defendant was returned to the Tarrant County Correctional Center in Fort Worth, and the courtroom activity ceased until the jury would reconvene on Monday. With nothing else to do, I decided to head back to my hotel, the Hilton Garden Inn in downtown Dallas. On the way, I stopped at a bar for a quick meal and a beer. I had just finished my burger and was halfway through my drink when a familiar voice behind me caught my attention. Turning around, I immediately recognized her. It was Ashley Marks, a close friend from high school whom I hadn't seen in over 17 years. Back in the day, we'd been inseparable, along with Steve Jenkins and Jolene Carter, calling ourselves the Four Musketeers. But our tight-knit group had dissolved when Ashley moved to Austin during senior year, and we'd lost touch. We caught up quickly. Ashley had graduated from the University of Texas, gotten married and divorced, and was now working as a reporter for the Austin Statesman. Her humor was as sharp as ever, particularly when recounting her ex-husband's infidelity and eventual fall from grace. Despite her sarcastic tone, it was clear she had moved on. She then mentioned her reason for being in Dallas, covering the Jenkins trial. "I saw you testify," she said, bringing up the tragic fate of Jolene. It was sobering to revisit those memories, but Ashley's presence was oddly comforting. As the conversation shifted, Ashley surprised me with a proposition. She wanted to write my story, offering to act as a buffer between me and the relentless press. Her approach was thoughtful, promising editorial control and an exclusive agreement. While the attention from major media outlets had been overwhelming, something about her made me feel I could trust her. After some consideration, I agreed. Ashley then suggested a plan. She proposed we use the weekend to drive out to my hometown, a couple of hours west of Dallas. There, she could see where everything happened, meet my family, and gather details for the story. It sounded like a welcome distraction from the trial, so I agreed. We decided to grab a few essentials from our hotel rooms and meet by my truck in the parking lot. True to form, she teased me about my oversized blue pickup, a reminder of the Bill Jennings she'd always known. By the time we hit the road, the familiarity between us felt effortless, as if no time had passed since those carefree high school days. Night had already fallen as we merged onto Highway 20 toward Abilene, a relief for me since I've always hated driving under the glare of the sun. Ashley, now dressed in a denim skirt and a crisp white Western blouse, looked as striking as she had in high school. She caught me glancing at her legs, a brief moment that didn't go unnoticed. "Still the same cowboy, huh?" she teased with a knowing smile. I chuckled. Maybe some things don't change. Ashley shifted the conversation to the task at hand, placing a small recorder on the dashboard. "You mind if I record this?" she asked. I didn't, as I wanted her to get the details right. I began recounting my past, starting with high school. After Ashley moved away, it had been just me, Steve, and Jolene. Jolene and I got engaged right after graduation, and Steve and I enlisted in the Marines. We trained together in San Diego, but our paths split soon after. He joined the infantry while I trained in electronics, eventually landing at Quantico. Not long after, Steve returned home on medical leave, his knee injury ending his military career. His father's influence secured him a job with the county, which later launched his political career. I married Jolene after finishing training, and Steve was my best man, though, as I later learned, he played a much more intimate role in Jolene's life. Ashley winced at the revelation, and I pressed on, explaining how life unfolded. My military career took us to various bases. Jolene and I had 2 children, Brian and Jessica, during my deployments. At the time, I never questioned their resemblance to Steve. People always said Steve and I looked like brothers, so it didn't cross my mind. Ashley pointed out how clear the resemblance was in the photos she'd seen, but I explained that the truth only became apparent as the kids grew older. After my service, we returned to Texas, and I began working at my dad's computer store. The job required a lot of travel, which Jolene didn't seem to mind. In hindsight, it was likely because my absences gave her time to continue her affair with Steve, right in our home. Ashley was appalled, especially when I told her that Steve even had his own chair in the living room and was often referred to as Uncle Steve by the kids at Jolene's insistence. I paused before sharing the darker conclusion. When I found out, I didn't just confront her. I made sure to erase everything tied to that betrayal. Her wedding dress, the mattress, the couch. All of it went up in flames. Ashley leaned back, processing my words. "I don't blame you," she said quietly. We drove in silence for a moment before I suggested a break. "I could use some fresh coffee. Want to stop?" She turned off the recorder and nodded. "Perfect. I could use a smoke." We pulled into a roadside diner, both needing a moment to recharge before continuing down memory lane. The highway stretched ahead as we merged back onto the road, continuing our drive toward Abilene after a quick stop. Ashley, ever the reporter, placed her recorder on the dashboard and leaned back, ready to dig deeper. "So, you had no idea Jolene and Steve were seeing each other all that time?" she asked. I shook my head. "Not a clue. Jolene never disrespected me outright. They were careful, probably had years to perfect their routine." "When did you finally find out?" she pressed. "About a year ago. I was in Los Angeles for a month-long training course. Jolene and the kids stayed home and kept in touch regularly. Calls, emails, even pictures. One weekend, Brian emailed me a photo from a fishing trip with Jolene and Steve. That's when I noticed it. I handed her my phone, guiding her to the album. "Take a look at this picture." Ashley examined the photo of Brian holding a bass, Steve sitting next to him, and Jolene standing on the other side with her hand on Steve's shoulder. "Oh my God," she murmured. "They look so alike, Steve and Brian. Same dimples, even." I nodded. "Exactly. But that wasn't all. Notice Jolene's hand?" Ashley zoomed in. "No rings," she said, puzzled. "Exactly. And I later found out where those rings ended up." I directed her to another photo folder. "Look for the ashtray." When she found the image, she gasped. "Is that her wedding ring and your great-grandmother's ring?" I nodded grimly. "Yep. And guess whose ashes are in that ashtray?" "Steve's," she guessed. "That's right. And here's the kicker. It was on my nightstand, which means Steve wasn't just in my house. He was in my bed, probably with Jolene." Ashley's eyes welled up. "How could she do that to you?" "Jessica was the one who found it," I explained. "She'd been helping my mom clean and snapped a picture before they left for the lake. She mailed me the rings at my request, but Jolene had no idea." Ashley let out a laugh. "I bet Jolene lost her mind over those rings." "She did. She even roped Steve into helping her search the house, digging through garbage and taking apart sink drains. They never figured it out." "And what did you do?" Ashley asked. "When I got home, Jolene was frantic, crying about losing her grandmother's ring. I played along, asking the usual questions. Did you check here? There? Then I pulled the rings out of my pocket." Ashley raised her eyebrows. "What did she say?" "She was stunned. I told her a trusted friend found them and mailed them to me. I didn't mention Jessica because I knew she'd take it out on her. Then I said, maybe don't leave them in the ashtray the next time Steve comes over." Ashley shook her head. "I can't believe you stayed calm." "That's when I realized it was over," I admitted. "I didn't have concrete proof yet, so I started gathering evidence. First, I arranged for DNA tests on the kids. I also set up surveillance, motion-activated cameras, audio recorders, and even bugged our phones. Everything was stored on my server and backed up in the cloud." "How did you get Steve's DNA?" Ashley asked. I smirked. "Easy. He came over that Sunday, as usual, and fell asleep in his chair. A quick cheek swab while he snored, and I had what I needed. The results came back a week later." Ashley leaned forward, clearly invested. "And?" I glanced at her, my jaw tightening. That's when everything unraveled. The DNA test confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. There was a 99.9% chance Steve was the father of both my kids. That meant his affair with Jolene had likely been going on for over 16 years. "You had no idea?" Ashley asked, incredulous. "Not a clue," I admitted. Looking back, I probably could have pieced it together, but she never gave me a reason to doubt her. Things seemed normal, good even, right up until the end. It wasn't until I started digging that the truth surfaced. I explained how I set up surveillance in the house. It didn't take long to catch them. While I was in Oklahoma City on a work trip, Jolene invited Steve over. I checked in with her earlier, and she assured me everything was fine, even saying she loved me. But by 9 p.m., I was watching them together, on camera, in my bed. Hearing their casual remarks and laughter hurt more than the betrayal itself. Ashley shook her head. "What did you do after that?" Before I could answer, I focused on the road ahead. It was dark and narrow, with no streetlights or guardrails. The stretch was known for wildlife and the occasional run-in with Steve's old associates. Most had been dealt with after his death, but I wasn't taking any chances. I flipped on the high beams, activated the light bar, and retrieved my Magnum from the glove box. We finally reached my house, and Ashley noticed a car parked in the driveway. "Who's that?" "Security," I said. "They've been watching the place since Steve's arrest. Some of his friends tried causing trouble, but we shut that down quickly." As we parked, an officer stepped out of the car. "Bill Jennings? Thought you were still in Dallas for the trial." "The jury's deliberating," I explained. "This is Ashley Marks, a reporter from the Austin Statesman. She's here to write an article." He tipped his hat. "Nice to meet you, ma'am. It's been quiet since the Rangers cleaned things up, but we're keeping watch. Let me know if you need anything." After exchanging a few words, Ashley and I entered the house. I gave her a tour explaining its history. Built in 1866 by my great-great-grandfather, the house had been expanded and updated over the years, though traces of the original structure remained. It now had 5 bedrooms, a modern kitchen, and a covered porch. I suggested Ashley take the master bedroom, the only one with an attached bathroom, while I'd sleep on the futon in my office. It was where I'd been sleeping ever since learning about Jolene's betrayal. Ashley dismissed the idea. "Nonsense. The bed's big enough for both of us. We're adults. We can handle it." Her confidence caught me off guard, but I relented. "If you're sure." With a smile, she led me to the living room. "Now, let's get back to your story." "Let me call the kids first," I said. "They should know we're coming by tomorrow." After calling my parents and chatting with the kids, we confirmed plans to visit them for lunch the next day. I grabbed some coffee and walked into the living room, bringing a small stack of DVDs from the study. They were kept locked away for good reason. "This will give you everything you need," I told Ashley, setting them down. Her eyes widened. "How much evidence do you have?" "Plenty," I said. "Footage from the house, office security recordings, scanned documents, photos, audio files, you name it. I've made multiple backups just in case." I selected one DVD, checked the label, and slid it into the player. "This one is graphic. Be prepared." Ashley nodded, bracing herself as I hit play. The video opened with Jolene entering the bedroom, followed by Steve. She removed her rings and tossed them into the ashtray on my nightstand. Steve smirked, stubbing out his cigarette on them. "Screw him and his great-grandmother's ring," Jolene said. Steve laughed. Ashley winced, tears welling in her eyes. As the scene escalated, I fast-forwarded through the worst parts. She gave me a grateful look. "This clip is about an hour," I said. "The real punch is in their pillow talk." By the time the footage slowed, Jolene and Steve were lying back, cigarettes in hand. Jolene turned toward him. "I'm pregnant again," she said. "Looks like you're going to be a daddy." Steve frowned. "Didn't you take the pill?" "Maybe I missed a couple of days," Jolene admitted. "But that's it," Steve groaned. "Why not use a protection?" "You know I hate those things," she replied. "But I can't have another pregnancy termination. The last one almost liquidated me, and Bill had a vasectomy because of you." Steve shrugged. "Then convince him it's his kid, or leave him and marry me." Jolene sighed. "That's all I've ever wanted, but I know you don't want that." "Exactly," Steve said. "Bill works and pays the bills. Why mess that up? He's too dumb to catch on anyway. We could do this in front of him and he wouldn't notice." Jolene hesitated. "What if we just get rid of him?" she asked. "An accident on Indian Trail, maybe poison?" Steve lit another cigarette. "We'll figure it out, but not until the kids are out of the house. Then we can take his insurance and whatever's left of his business. For now, let's play it smart." Jolene agreed, and the scene descended into another round of coupling. I stopped the video, unable to stomach anymore. Ashley was shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. "I hate her," she whispered. "How did you live with that for 17 years? Please tell me you saw a lawyer after this." I nodded. "I did. That day changed everything. Let me explain." I recounted my visit to Alan Jackson, the family lawyer who had handled all our affairs. What he revealed shook me to my core and set the stage for what came next. The meeting with Alan began straightforwardly enough, but it quickly took a turn. I showed him the evidence, the DNA report and video of Jolene's affair with Steve. Alan laid out my legal options, explaining that, while Texas is a community property state, I could pursue divorce on grounds of adultery or cruelty. Adultery wasn't a crime, but it could heavily influence property division and alimony. He even noted it could be used in civil litigation. But then Alan got to the real issue. "Bill," he said, "the law is on your side, but Steve is the problem. He runs this county like a personal fiefdom. He controls the sheriff's department and most of the judges. You'd have to file in this county since you've lived here for 90 days, but I don't think you'll find a judge willing to take the case. And with Jolene's pregnancy, the courts won't finalize anything until the baby is born, regardless of paternity. He paused before continuing. Steve already knows you might pursue a divorce. He's made it clear that I'm to report any attempts you make. I stared at him. Are you saying Steve ordered you to violate attorney-client privilege? Alan nodded reluctantly. Bill, I don't like it, but I'm not willing to end up buried on Indian Trail. You don't know what you're up against. I stood, anger simmering. I'm sorry, Alan, but I don't have a choice. You're fired. I'll need all the family and business files, and I want them now. To his credit, Alan had anticipated this. He gestured to 2 boxes by the door. Everything's ready, he said, scribbling a note on a piece of paper and handing it to me. Call the people on this list. They're interested in Steve's activities. Alan helped carry the boxes to my truck. Before leaving, he looked around nervously. Bill, Steve's likely keeping tabs on you. Be careful. I shook his hand. Thanks, Alan. I'll take it from here. Driving back, I mulled over what Alan had said. I wasn't concerned about firing him. My father would understand. Steve, however, was a different story. I called the numbers Alan had given me and arranged meetings with a high-powered family lawyer, a state prosecutor, and a senior Texas Ranger, all based in Dallas. At home, I told my dad about firing Alan and showed him the evidence. His reaction was immediate. Holy hell! I knew Steve was bad, but not like this. Get the kids out of the house. There's no telling what they might try. We quickly made a plan. Dad suggested I tell Jolene I was heading to Phoenix for work while he stayed with the kids. I agreed, knowing I'd need to explain things to Brian and Jessica later. I called Brian's cell. You and Jessica are staying with your grandparents starting today, I said. What's going on, Dad? I'll explain later. Just be home right after school. Grandpa will pick you up. Okay, Dad. Love you, he said. Love you too, buddy. Minutes later, a text from my secretary popped up. Bill, Steve Jenkins is here to see you. I prepared for the meeting by placing my Magnum on the desk within easy reach, turning on a hidden camera to record everything, and instructing my secretary to notify my father that Steve had arrived. Steve entered the office with his usual overconfidence, immediately noticing the 9mm Magnum on my desk. His smirk and casual demeanor betrayed his arrogance. Steve wasted no time addressing the reason for his visit. He revealed that he was aware of my meeting with Alan Jackson and made it clear that any attempt to divorce Jolene would face his interference. Steve insisted he wouldn't allow me to take him to court or expose their affair, regardless of what I knew. He dismissed my right to confront him, brushing off the betrayal as if it were trivial. What followed was a horrifying admission. Steve bragged about how his relationship with Jolene had started during our senior prom and continued sporadically after I enlisted in the Marines. He recounted the moments when their affair intensified, particularly while I was stationed away from home. He even claimed paternity of my children, casually recounting how they ensured Jolene's pregnancies aligned with their plans, including her vasectomy request to prevent her from having my children. With each detail, it became clear how deeply intertwined their deception was. Then Steve shifted from boasting to issuing a chilling threat. He outlined how he intended to take control of my life, dictating the terms of my marriage and even threatening harm to my children if I didn't comply. He flaunted his influence over the county, asserting control over law enforcement and the judicial system. His confidence in his power and impunity was undeniable. After Steve left, I stopped the recording and burned the footage to a DVD. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, I sent copies to my father and the contacts Alan had provided, including a high-powered family lawyer, a state prosecutor, and a senior officer in the Texas Rangers. I then called my father, informing him of Steve's threats and the urgency of the situation. Together, we decided to act immediately. The first step was to ensure the safety of my children. I contacted their school, emphasizing that neither Jolene nor Steve should be allowed to pick them up under any circumstances. This was followed by a call to my son, Brian, instructing him to collect his sister and head straight to their grandparents' house without delay. I reassured him that I would explain everything later, but stressed the importance of following my instructions without question. Armed with my Magnum and the evidence, I left the office and drove directly home. During the drive, my thoughts raced, fueled by anger and a growing resolve to protect my family. When I arrived, Steve's truck was gone, but Jolene's car was in the driveway. It was a small relief, as it meant I could address the situation without immediate interference from Steve. I knew my father would arrive soon, ready to help me take the next steps in removing Jolene and securing the safety of my children. This was the turning point. As I entered the house, I moved cautiously, scanning for any signs of Steve or others who might be lurking with ill intentions. My right hand rested on my holstered magnum, ready for anything. The house seemed quiet at first, but then Jolene appeared, descending the stairs. Her expression shifted when she saw me. Feigning concern, she asked why I was home early. Her reaction changed quickly when I confronted her about Steve's possible presence, hinting at his involvement in setting me up for harm. Jolene's face paled as I revealed that I knew the truth about her and Steve. She stammered an apology, but I cut her off and set the record straight. I loaded the damning footage onto the TV, pressing play on Steve's smug confessions and threats. Jolene's feigned innocence melted as she scrambled for excuses, claiming Steve's words were empty and that we could work things out. Her pleas fell on deaf ears. The video was undeniable proof of her betrayal, and I was done tolerating her lies. Without raising my voice, I removed her wedding rings and threw mine into her hand. Jolene begged for forgiveness, but I shut her down and demanded she leave the house immediately. Grabbing her purse, I tossed it to her and escorted her out the door. Her protests continued as she asked where she could go, but I coldly told her to find solace with Steve or anyone else. Her fate was no longer my concern. As we stood in the driveway, 2 vehicles pulled in. My father's truck blocked access to the house, with Steve's arriving moments later. Steve barely avoided hitting my father's truck as he skidded to a halt. He exited his vehicle, only to be met by my father stepping out with a loaded rifle. My father made it clear that Steve was violating a restraining order requiring him and Jolene to stay 500 feet away from our property and family. Steve, unaccustomed to such defiance, froze as my father held his ground. The tension escalated when 2 state highway patrol cars arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the scene. 4 officers stepped out, armed and ready, and took control of the situation. One officer approached Steve with the restraining order in hand, while another addressed Jolene. They served her with the same document, instructing her to leave the property immediately or face arrest. I interrupted before the officers could leave, presenting a digital recorder. Playing back Jolene's recent threats against me and the kids, I made my case for her immediate arrest. The officer listened intently before cuffing Jolene and informing her of her Miranda rights. Steve, watching the scene unfold, became enraged as another officer moved to arrest him as well. His protests, claiming his power and influence, were dismissed outright by the law enforcement officials. Adding to Steve's humiliation, a local news crew arrived just in time to record the arrests. The footage, including Steve's belligerent outbursts, would later air on the evening news. As officers led him away, he shouted threats of retaliation, vowing to ruin anyone involved. Although I hadn't yet provided all the evidence of their plot against me, I knew my contacts in Dallas were already working on building a case. While the day had been chaotic, the arrests of Jolene and Steve marked the beginning of justice being served. As the news van repositioned to allow the patrol cars to leave, the reporter and cameraman approached me, my father following close behind. The reporter wasted no time, asking why Commissioner Jenkins had been arrested. I responded bluntly, explaining that threats to liquidate were felonies, even for prominent politicians. Without elaborating, I excused myself, citing the need to focus on my children. Walking away, I couldn't help but think about how Steve's carefully curated image of a family values champion had just been shattered. His supporters might not have known the real Steve Jenkins, but they were about to learn. At my parents' house, I sat my family down and explained everything. Telling Brian and Jessica the truth about Steve's paternity was gut-wrenching. They struggled to process it, but ultimately rejected the DNA results' significance. To them, I was their father, and nothing would change that. Their resilience and loyalty filled me with pride as we embraced, shedding tears together. After a heartfelt goodbye, I returned to my house, packed a few days' worth of clothes, and drove to Dallas for critical meetings. The next morning, I met Dave Brooks, the sharp Dallas attorney known for his aggressive courtroom tactics. To my surprise, he had already arranged a meeting with the state prosecutor, John Hancock, and Texas Ranger Captain Don Jacobs. Dave apologized for the sudden gathering, explaining that my recent evidence had accelerated their plans. John Hancock opened the meeting by expressing regret for what I'd endured. He then laid out the harsh reality. Steve Jenkins wasn't just a cheater, he was a criminal of the highest order. Evidence linked him to pills trafficking, illicit arms dealing, human trafficking, and sleeping for money. Even more horrifying, forensic investigations tied Steve to 6 murders. Jolene, my wife, wasn't just complicit. She had been actively involved, particularly in the sleeping for money ring. The timeline for building the case had been cut short by Steve's threats against me and my children, forcing law enforcement to act faster than planned. Don Jacobs detailed how deeply compromised the local sheriff's department had become under Steve's influence. Texas Rangers and DSS officers were temporarily replacing the department to stabilize the situation, even overseeing the jails where Steve and Jolene were being held. Time was critical to prevent further fallout. Dave shifted the focus to my divorce. He proposed pursuing an annulment based on Jolene's criminal behavior and deception. If annulment wasn't possible, he'd file for divorce on grounds of adultery and mental cruelty, ensuring I retained all assets and custody of the children. The meeting continued for another hour as we discussed strategy and potential outcomes. Before I left, Dave handed me a DVD containing damning footage of Jolene's actions, collected by both private and government investigators. He warned that some of the content was explicit and implicated multiple individuals, including local deputies. John was straightforward about his plans. He intended to seek the death penalty for Steve Jenkins. Jolene, he said, might escape with life imprisonment without parole. He also issued a stern warning. My life and my children's lives were at risk. Steve and Jolene had a history of eliminating those who got in their way. He urged me to remain vigilant and contact them immediately if I noticed anything suspicious. As I drove home, my mind raced with thoughts of betrayal and disbelief. Steve, once my best friend, was a murderer and a criminal mastermind. Jolene, the woman I had loved and trusted, had been his partner in nearly every atrocity. The weight of 17 years of lies pressed heavily on me. When I arrived back in town, my phone rang. Brian's panicked voice came through the line. He urged me to come home immediately but wouldn't explain. My stomach tightened as the call ended abruptly. I knew something was very wrong. Racing home, I arrived in under 20 minutes, my heart sinking as I saw an ambulance and highway patrol cars parked in front of the house. Memories of the warnings I'd received flooded my mind. Rushing to the door, I was stopped by paramedics wheeling a gurney out. When they pulled back the sheet, Jolene's lifeless face stared back at me. "She's gone," one paramedic said quietly. Oddly, I felt no grief. Inside, Steve was being carried out on another gurney, groaning in pain. His left shoulder had been shattered by a rifle blast, but he was alive. Ignoring him, I found my father and children standing together, shaken but unharmed. Relief washed over me as I embraced them, making sure they were okay before asking what had happened. My father explained that he had brought Brian and Jessica to the house to gather belongings when Steve and Jolene arrived. They had somehow managed to bail out of jail. A fight broke out between Jessica and Jolene, escalating when Steve pulled a tool. My father, hearing the commotion, entered with his rifle just as Steve's tool discharged, striking Jolene in the abdomen. Reacting quickly, my father fired at Steve, wounding him in the shoulder before calling emergency. Brian had called me shortly after. Jolene hadn't survived long, succumbing to her injuries before the ambulance arrived. Despite the chaos, my father reassured me that he had done what he could to protect everyone. I remembered that the home security system was still recording. Checking the footage, I confirmed the entire incident was captured. I shared the video with the responding officers, who asked me to make a copy for their investigation. Later, while recounting the events to Ashley over coffee, she asked to see the video. I played the footage, which began with Jolene and Steve entering the house, demanding that the children leave with them. Jessica, defiant, refused and stood her ground. When Jolene grabbed her, Jessica fought back, leading to a heated exchange. The confrontation escalated when Steve pulled a rifle and Jolene tried unsuccessfully to de-escalate the situation. Chaos erupted, with an exchange of fire claiming Jolene's life and wounding Steve. After the video ended, Ashley wiped away tears as I stood up, emotionally drained. Needing a break, I suggested stepping outside for some fresh air. Ashley followed, and we sat in silence on the back porch, sipping coffee under the night sky. Breaking the silence, Ashley remarked on the darkness and stillness, a stark contrast to her city life. Turning to me, she urged me to find a way to move forward before the pain consumed me. I admitted how hard it was to process the betrayal, feeling as though the life I had built was a lie. My children weren't even mine biologically. Ashley shared her own experience with betrayal, reminding me that not everyone was untrustworthy. She placed her arms around me, offering comfort and reassurance. Her presence was grounding, and I appreciated her support. We reflected on what might have been if life had taken a different course. Ashley admitted she had once been jealous of Jolene, and I confessed similar thoughts about her. We laughed at the irony and wondered how things might have turned out if we'd met under different circumstances. Looking at her, I realized how much I valued her presence in my life. For the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. As the evening wound down, we returned to the house to relax. I opted to sleep on the couch, a habit I'd developed since Jolene's death. Though a DSS officer was stationed outside, I couldn't shake the unease that one of Steve's associates might try something. Besides, I wasn't ready to explore anything more with Ashley yet. She understood, teasing me lightly not to make it a routine. The next morning I woke to the aroma of bacon. Ashley stood over me, clad in a long t-shirt, announcing breakfast was ready. In the kitchen I found a feast: pancakes, bacon, sausage, grits, eggs, toast, and even cookies and gravy. She'd even remembered peanut butter for my pancakes. Sitting down, I marveled at the spread. Ashley quipped that it had been ages since she cooked for a man, making it clear her ex-husband never appreciated homemade breakfasts. I dove into the meal, savoring every bite, while we discussed the day's plans. Ashley wanted to visit my family, speak with Jolene's mother, and, if time allowed, stop by Jolene's gravesite. After breakfast, I showered and shaved, reflecting on Ashley's presence. She brought a calm and joy I hadn't felt in years. By the time we left for my parents' house, I found myself feeling unexpectedly content. When we arrived, Brian and Jessica ran out to greet us. I introduced them to Ashley and we headed inside. Ashley explained her intention to interview the family members individually and requested privacy for the conversations. My mom retreated to the kitchen, while my dad and I hung back, making small talk and avoiding heavier topics like Jolene or Steve. Ashley spent time with Jessica and Brian, then moved on to my parents. While she worked, the kids and I played soccer outside. Ashley eventually joined us, her natural bond with the kids evident. For a moment, it felt like I had a complete family again. After lunch, it was time to leave. As we prepared to go, Jessica pulled me aside and whispered that if I didn't ask Ashley to marry me, she'd take matters into her own hands. I promised her I'd think about it. On the drive, I asked Ashley how the interviews went. She explained that speaking to everyone privately allowed her to gather unbiased perspectives. She'd learned that my family had always supported me but had harbored suspicions about Jolene. However, they had refrained from interfering to avoid causing problems. Ashley also shared something chilling. Jessica confided that Steve had been giving her inappropriate attention for a while. My anger surged at the revelation, but Ashley's calm presence helped me focus. She emphasized how much she enjoyed the warmth of my family and thanked me for including her. We soon pulled up to the apartment where Jolene's mother, Myrna, lived. As we approached the door, Ashley declined a private interview, suggesting that this was a conversation Myrna and I needed to have together. I nodded, bracing myself for what was to come. Myrna Carter opened the door as soon as I knocked, moving slowly due to both her health and the weight of grief. She had been alone since Jolene's father died in a mysterious accident years ago, and Jolene's recent death had only deepened her isolation. I hugged her, asking how she was doing. She assured me she was fine before greeting Ashley warmly, complimenting her on how little she'd changed since high school. We sat down, and I explained Ashley's purpose for the visit. Myrna nodded, her expression a mix of sadness and resignation. When Ashley asked how long she had known about Jolene's affair with Steve, Myrna hesitated, her eyes dropping in shame. She admitted she had known almost from the start, recounting how Steve practically lived with Jolene during the year I was stationed in Okinawa. Myrna confessed she had warned Jolene she was making a mistake, but her daughter refused to listen. When I asked why Jolene hadn't left me if she wanted to be with Steve, Myrna explained that Jolene had loved us both in different ways. I represented stability and security, while Steve offered adventure and recklessness. Despite this, I couldn't reconcile Jolene's betrayal and deception, especially after discovering she had passed Steve's children off as mine and later conspired with him to harm us. Myrna insisted Jolene had loved me, at least at first, but admitted Steve's influence had grown over time, eventually taking control of her. Ashley pressed further, asking about Jolene's pregnancy termination. Myrna confirmed she knew about them and had tried to convince Jolene to divorce me. Jolene had dismissed the idea, laughing and saying she would inherit everything eventually. Myrna revealed this conversation had taken place about 1.5 years ago, indicating how long Jolene and Steve had plotted against me. I asked Myrna if her late husband had known about any of this. She believed he did, recalling a conversation he'd had with Steve shortly before his fatal car accident. Given her husband's meticulous care of his vehicles, the accident had always seemed suspicious. Investigators had never explained how a brake line failed or why the car lost traction. Myrna expressed her sorrow over Jolene's memorial service, which no one attended except her and a priest. She thanked me for covering the cremation costs, and noted how touched she was that Jolene had been cremated in her wedding dress. Ashley looked at me curiously and asked why I had done that. I explained that I thought it fitting, given the circumstances. I had burned the dress along with Jolene, along with her wedding ring, though I had left her engagement ring intact. Ashley seemed amused as she jotted down notes. Myrna also mentioned that Jolene had an IRA worth $350,000 and a separate savings account with $200,000. Funds I had only discovered after her death. I had set the money aside in a trust fund for the kids, ensuring their future education. Ashley, intrigued, made note of this as well. Before we left, Myrna apologized again for not speaking up sooner. I reassured her, encouraging her to visit the kids whenever she wanted. She hugged me and Ashley, thanking us for stopping by and asking us not to be strangers. As we drove away, Ashley couldn't resist asking again about the wedding dress. I simply replied, "It felt right at the time." Ashley focused on her notes while I headed to the cemetery. The grounds were quiet and pristine, leading us to the columbarium where Jolene's ashes were interred. A small granite plaque marked the spot, bearing only her name, birth year, and death year. There was no mention of her life, her roles, or her relationships. Ashley observed the simplicity of the marker and noted that at least her remains were treated with dignity. I explained that it was done more out of consideration for Myrna than Jolene. If it had been entirely my decision, I admitted, the ashes might have ended up in a less respectful place. Even the use of Jolene's maiden name on the plaque was deliberate. I felt it was fitting since she hadn't valued our family name during her life, so there was no need to attach it to her in death. Suggestions to inscribe phrases like loving wife and mother had been rejected because, frankly, they didn't reflect the truth. As we stood by the plaque, Ashley gently reminded me that there was still a lot of unresolved anger within me. She asked if I had ever truly grieved for Jolene. I admitted I hadn't. Any love I once had for her had been extinguished by years of betrayal, lies, and the threats she had made against me and the children. Saying it aloud brought a wave of shame, and emotions I hadn't allowed myself to feel began to surface. Fighting the tears, I turned away, but Ashley stopped me. She insisted that I let go of the pain before it consumed me. Her words hit a nerve, and everything I had been holding back came rushing out. For the first time since Jolene's death, I broke down completely. Ashley held me tightly, offering silent comfort as I sobbed. When I finally regained control, I noticed tears on her face as well. She reminded me that Jolene had been her friend too, once part of our group of close-knit friends. Despite everything Jolene had done, there was a part of Ashley that still mourned the person Jolene used to be. Ashley's presence grounded me. She reassured me that she was there, and she wasn't going anywhere. Her words offered a glimmer of solace, a promise of stability in the chaos my life had become. After a moment, she suggested we move on with the day, including a stop at the store before heading to dinner. We decided on Charlie's, a local steakhouse known for its food and live music. The plan felt right, a chance to step out of the shadow of the past. After running errands at the farmer's market, we returned home to prepare. For the first time in years, the house felt like more than just a shell. It felt alive. I got ready quickly, then waited for Ashley, who emerged looking stunning in a denim skirt, white blouse, and cowboy boots. She carried herself with a confidence and warmth that was magnetic. Dinner at Charlie's didn't disappoint. The steaks were perfect, the atmosphere lively, and the band set the mood. We danced through the night, two-steps, waltzes, even a line dance. During a slow dance, Ashley pulled me close and kissed me, whispering words that revealed the depth of her feelings. It was in that moment that I realized my own feelings for her had grown into something undeniable. As we wrapped up the evening, Ashley playfully hinted that the night shouldn't end on the dance floor. Her teasing warmth and affection felt like a balm for everything I had endured. We left Charlie's together, the past fading just a little more with each step we took forward. After finally arriving home, I parked the truck in the garage and shut the door behind us. Eager to leave the car, we made our way inside, where the excitement of the evening gradually gave way to a calm intimacy. Lying together on the bed, Ashley wrapped her arms around me, and I found my thoughts drifting over the whirlwind of the past 2 days. Only 36 hours earlier, I had been a broken man, consumed by the betrayal of a wife who had lied, cheated, and conspired with someone I once trusted. Now, with Ashley by my side, I was rediscovering what it meant to feel loved. Though I knew what I wanted to do next, I hesitated, worried she might think I was rushing things, but the thought of holding back didn't sit well. Gathering my courage, I reached into the nightstand and retrieved a small box. Inside was my great-grandmother's engagement ring, carefully cleaned and ready for this moment. Ashley's gaze shifted to the box in my hand as I told her about its history. The ring was more than a piece of jewelry. It symbolized a century of Jennings family resilience and love. My great-grandfather had given it to my great-grandmother before leaving to fight in World War I. Though he survived the war, exposure to gas had cut his life short. Later, the ring was passed to my grandfather, who wore it during battles in the Pacific before starting a family of his own. Eventually, it came to me, a gift of tradition and hope. As I shared the story, Ashley's eyes filled with emotion. She understood its significance and what it meant for me to offer it to her. Without hesitation, she accepted the ring and promised to wear it with pride. However, she added one condition. She wanted me to reverse my vasectomy so we could have children and perhaps pass the ring on to future generations. I agreed without hesitation, slipping the ring onto her finger as we sealed the moment with a kiss. That night, we expressed our love in the most intimate way, finally falling asleep in each other's arms. The next morning, I woke to the mouth-watering aroma of bacon. After finishing my chores, I joined Ashley in the kitchen, where she had prepared another of her legendary breakfasts. We ate together, savoring the meal and the easy companionship that had become so natural between us. Later, we packed for the trip to Dallas, deciding to shower together before leaving, which inevitably led to another passionate encounter. Once we were ready, I called the kids to share the news. Putting the call on speaker, I told Brian and Jessica about our engagement. Their reactions were immediate and joyful. Brian let out a celebratory cheer while Jessica expressed her happiness and approval. My parents joined the conversation, welcoming Ashley into the family with open arms and teasing affection. My dad jokingly invited Ashley to call him Daddy, a sentiment that made everyone laugh. Before ending the call, I encouraged Brian and Jessica to visit Jolene's mother, Myrna, from time to time. Though complicated, she was still their grandmother, and I wanted them to maintain some connection with her. Both kids agreed, showing once again how thoughtful and kind-hearted they were. As we loaded up the truck for the trip back, Ashley's earlier words to my mom lingered in my mind. Curious about her plans, I asked how she envisioned managing a potential long-distance relationship. She revealed she had already taken steps to make Dallas her home, mentioning that the editor-in-chief of the local paper, the Daily Record, was retiring soon. Ashley had applied for the position and felt optimistic about her chances. She explained that her qualifications aligned perfectly with the board's goals, and she had already begun developing strategies to revitalize the paper's circulation. Even if the job didn't materialize, Ashley reassured me that she was committed to making our relationship work. Her confidence and determination were infectious, and I felt deeply grateful for her support. Together, we drove toward Dallas, ready to face whatever came next, knowing we had each other to rely on. Ashley wrapped her arms around my neck, her gaze steady and affectionate, as she expressed her relief at no longer working in a chaotic environment like the Statesman. She reflected on the toll of constant travel, late-night assignments, and living out of hotels. Moving to a smaller paper, even with a potential pay cut, felt like a chance to finally settle down and create a stable life. She mentioned other possibilities, like freelancing or writing a book, but ultimately admitted she'd prefer spending her days with me. After securing the house, we headed out. I picked a few flowers from the garden, planning a small detour. Ashley, teasing, joked about secret rendezvous, but quickly apologized, acknowledging how past betrayals lingered for both of us. I assured her the stop was about closure, not secrets. We arrived at the cemetery and stood by Jolene's marker. I placed the flowers in a nearby vase and spoke aloud, telling Jolene about my upcoming marriage to Ashley. Though she was gone, saying it aloud felt cathartic. Ashley added that, if the children agreed, she intended to adopt them. This gesture struck me deeply. As we walked back to the truck, I asked if she truly wanted to take that step. Without hesitation, Ashley affirmed that the kids deserved a trustworthy mother, and she was ready to be that person. Her commitment to my children solidified my belief that marrying her was the right choice for all of us. The drive to Dallas was mostly quiet. Ashley worked on her story while I reflected on the whirlwind of recent months. Arriving at the hotel, Ashley suggested I move into her room since her newspaper was covering the cost. I offered to split the bill, but she waved it off, suggesting I handle future date expenses instead. Reluctantly, I agreed, checked out of my room, and moved in with her. That evening, we celebrated with steak, dancing, and a passionate night together. The next morning, we arrived early at the courthouse, securing good seats as the jury returned from their hotel to begin deliberations. Ashley seamlessly balanced her role as a reporter, gathering testimony and insights from attorneys and legal experts. By early afternoon, the jury reached a decision, and anticipation filled the courtroom. At 1:30, the jury re-entered. Steve sat motionless as the foreman handed the verdict to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. After confirming the verdict's unanimity, the judge read the outcome: guilty on all charges. The jury recommended the maximum penalty, death. Steve's attorney had gambled by letting the jury determine sentencing, hoping for leniency if the decision wasn't unanimous. That gamble failed. Steve was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder, 1 manslaughter charge, multiple conspiracy counts, and additional offenses involving smuggling, human trafficking, pills, and sleeping for money. The jury was polled individually, each juror affirming their agreement with the verdict. The judge addressed Steve directly, acknowledging his general reservations about the death penalty, but agreeing it was warranted in this case. He ordered Steve's transfer to Huntsville State Prison to await execution, closing with a somber invocation of mercy for Steve's soul. As the gavel fell, a sense of finality settled over the courtroom. Justice, though grim, had been served. As the court emptied, my attorney gestured for me to follow him. We caught up with the officers escorting Steve out, his hunched posture and tired eyes making him look years older. After a brief conversation with the officers, my attorney handed Steve 2 documents and instructed him to sign. Steve, clearly enraged, demanded to know what the papers were. My lawyer calmly explained. One document was a waiver relinquishing all parental rights to Brian and Jessica, while the other outlined the disposition of Steve's remaining estate. According to the will, after taxes and penalties, his assets would be divided equally among 3 parties: Myrna Carter, the mother of his late lover, the Brian Jennings Trust, and the Jessica Jennings Trust. Defeated, Steve reluctantly signed both forms. He glared at me with venom in his eyes, asking if I was satisfied. My response was blunt. I told him I would be, especially since Ashley and I were getting married, and she planned to adopt the kids. As the officers led him away, I left without looking back. That was the last I saw of Steve until his execution day. True to my word, I visited his grave afterward, ensuring it received a rather undignified farewell, though I made sure Ashley wasn't around. She wouldn't have approved. Finally, the nightmare was over, and I could look ahead to building a future with Ashley. Ashley stayed true to her promise, sharing the story she'd written about the ordeal before submitting it. Her work drew national attention, leading to appearances on several talk shows. Despite offers for a movie adaptation, she declined, but her efforts earned her a Pulitzer Prize. Though the Statesman hoped to keep her on staff, Ashley's priorities had shifted. They sent her off with a generous bonus and glowing recommendations. The Daily Record eagerly welcomed her as their new managing editor. Under her leadership, the paper's circulation tripled in its first year, prompting an expansion that included a new building and additional staff. When it came to our wedding, we opted for a simple backyard ceremony surrounded by family and friends. Ashley's parents made the trip from Austin, along with close colleagues from the Statesman. Her father proudly walked her down the aisle, warmly shaking my hand as he entrusted her to me. Brian served as my best man, while Jessica stood beside Ashley as her maid of honor, making it a celebration of our new family. After we exchanged vows, the minister turned us to face our loved ones, announcing us as Mr. and Mrs. William Jennings. The applause was thunderous, but the most meaningful moment came when Brian wrapped his arm around Ashley, welcoming her as his mom. Jessica quickly joined in, declaring her love for her new mother. Tears streamed down Ashley's face as she hugged them both. My dad then approached with an envelope containing tickets for a week-long Caribbean cruise. It was his way of sending us off on our new adventure together. We thanked him, laughing at the perfect gift to mark the start of our life as a family. 10 months later, Ashley gave birth to twins, a boy, William Frederick, named for my grandfather, and a girl, Alicia Marie, named for Ashley's grandmother. On the day they were born, I happened to run into George Mason, a prominent local politician. After congratulating me and accepting a celebratory cigar, he mentioned that an upcoming election had sparked conversations about me stepping into Steve's old commission seat. The idea of me, the man who had brought Steve down, filling his role carried poetic justice. I laughed off the suggestion, citing the financial strain of feeding 2 newborns. George pressed further, suggesting I could still manage my business while serving. My answer was simple, reflecting a lesson learned through painful experience. As my father had once reminded me, power corrupts,